Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where we take a slow walk through the forgotten corridors of human memory, a quiet place where science, history and mystery can share the same cup of tea without anyone rushing them to finish. Tonight, the conversation turns to a story pressed not into parchment or paper, but into clay that has survived the crumbling of civilizations. If you're here to unwind, to listen to something that feels both ancient and oddly alive, you've found a fitting companion. Because what we're about to explore isn't just an artifact or a legend. It's a timeline that stretches so far beyond reason that it forces us to rethink what history even means. The Sumerian King List. A name that sounds straightforward enough, like a bureaucratic inventory of old rulers. Yet what it contains isn't ordinary in any sense. It's a record that calmly states that before the first known kings of our human past, before cities and empires we recognise, there existed rulers whose reigns lasted for thousands upon thousands of years. In total, 240 years of kingship that began not on earth, but in heaven. To modernise, that reads like fantasy. But to the people of ancient Sumer it was history, the beginning of everything they knew. It's strange, isn't it, how a simple list can hold such weight. There are no grand speeches, no songs of glory carved beside these names, just numbers, names and cities, and yet each line opens a window into a world that feels impossibly distant. When scholars first translated the text, they hesitated. The numbers didn't make sense. The chronology was impossible, and yet the format was familiar. These weren't myths told as stories, they were written as facts. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Statements as casual as a birth certificate, as steady as a calendar entry. And then came the phrase that divided eras. Then the flood swept over. You can almost picture the first archaeologist reading those words under the yellow light of a tent lamp, wondering whether the ancient scribe who wrote them believed them literally. There's a peculiar beauty in that uncertainty, because when the Sumerians pressed those wedge-shaped signs into clay, they weren't recording a bedtime tale. They were documenting their world's foundation. In their view, history didn't begin with humanity alone. It began with a descent from the divine, a transference of authority from beings they called the Anunnaki, the great gods of heaven and earth. The Anunnaki were not gentle angels or distant deities of comfort. They were administrators of the cosmos, each responsible for an aspect of creation and civilization. To them, order came from hierarchy, and kingship was part of that order. The King List tells us that this kingship, the right to rule, descended from heaven. That phrase was not metaphorical to them. It meant exactly what it said, that power itself came down from the realm of the gods to the cities of men. Eridu, the first city, was where it landed. Eridu still exists, or at least its bones do, half buried in the soil of southern Iraq. Archaeologists describe layers upon layers of settlements there, stacked like the pages of a very old book. At the bottom lies the earliest known temple platform, built more than 7,000 years ago. The Sumerians said it was the home of Enki, god of water, wisdom, and creation. It's easy to see why they chose that spot. Even today, the land around Eridu feels ancient, dry, quiet, a place where time itself seems to hesitate. To the Sumerians, this was the first spark of civilization, the first place where gods and humans met in the open. When you look at what remains of their world, it's not hard to imagine why they thought of kingship as something sacred. The land was unpredictable. Floods, droughts, shifting rivers. To survive, you needed order, and to create order, you needed authority. A king wasn't just a ruler. He was a bridge between people and gods, responsible for maintaining balance in both the physical and spiritual sense. The King List captures that idea perfectly. It doesn't just record who ruled, it preserves the cosmic structure of rule itself, how divine order gradually transformed into human governance. If you've ever handled a piece of ancient pottery, you know how fragile it feels. Now imagine holding a small tablet of clay, impressed with signs that have carried meaning across 5 millennia. The Sumerian King List is one of those rare relics that feels both impossible and completely ordinary at once. It doesn't shout for attention. It just sits there, quietly existing, like a stone that's seen too much to bother explaining itself. But the moment you begin to read it, you sense something extraordinary. These weren't people obsessed with fantasy. They were accountants of the divine. The first time scholars tried to date the text, they realized it couldn't fit into any simple timeline. It mentioned real kings whose existence could be confirmed through other inscriptions, alongside rulers who clearly belonged to myth. It jumped from names like Alulim and Alalgar, figures who ruled before the flood, to names like Gilgamesh, who appears both in the King List and in the famous epic that bears his name. That blending of myth and verifiable history puzzled researchers. Some concluded it must have been a political document, designed to legitimize certain dynasties by linking them to divine ancestors. Others thought it was theological, a way of explaining how humanity inherited the world after divine ages ended. But the question remains, why such enormous numbers? Why claim that early kings ruled for 36,000 years when a human life rarely reached 70? One possibility lies in the Sumerians' mathematical system. They used a base 60 or sexagesimal notation. 60 was a sacred number representing completeness and celestial order. Multiplying it by itself created vast spans that might not have been meant literally but symbolically, as markers of cosmic cycles rather than human years. Perhaps those tens of thousands of years were their way of saying, these rulers belong to eternity. Or perhaps those numbers reflected something we still don't understand. A different kind of timekeeping altogether, one based on celestial events rather than solar years. Yet even when interpreted symbolically, the King List doesn't lose its mystery. If anything, it deepens it. Because beneath the arithmetic lies a consistent worldview. That history is cyclical, that divine order can rise and fall, and that the world itself has reset more than once. When the text says, then the flood swept over, it doesn't just describe a natural disaster, it marks a cosmic boundary, a moment when one version of the world ended and another began. After that line, the reign shortened drastically. Kings rule for hundreds of years, then decades. The gods step back and mortals take over. It's as if the text is describing humanity's graduation from childhood to self-rule, except that the memory of those early godlike kings never entirely fades. That transition from divine to human feels oddly familiar even now. You can see echoes of it in myths around the world. Egyptian pharaohs descending from Ra, Chinese emperors claiming the mandate of heaven, biblical patriarchs living for centuries before the flood, and then aging quickly after. Whether or not these stories share a literal connection, they all reflect the same pattern, a long golden age of divine rule followed by an age of decline. The Sumerian King List is simply the oldest version we have of that pattern written down. If you think about it, there's something deeply human about wanting to connect yourself to a line that stretches into eternity. Every civilization, in its own way, tries to trace its roots back to the divine. The Sumerians just happened to do it with extraordinary precision, by writing down every name, every reign, every number, as if the act of recording itself could preserve a link to heaven. It's hard not to admire that determination. In their minds, memory was sacred. To remember was to keep the gods alive. There's also a quieter layer to this. Imagine living in a world where you genuinely believe your ancestors were semi-divine, that your kings once spoke with gods face to face. That belief wouldn't just shape your religion, it would shape your entire sense of time. The past wouldn't feel distant, it would feel vertical, layered beneath you, still present, still powerful. You wouldn't see history as a straight line moving forward, but as a tower reaching upward toward the divine. That's how the King List reads, not as a timeline, but as a staircase. Each king, each city, each epoch, another step between earth and heaven. It's fascinating to think that this staircase begins in Eridu, a real city whose ruins we can still visit, and ends in the familiar names of early Mesopotamian history. It begins with gods and ends with men, and somewhere along the way, the flood divides one world from the next. You can almost feel that shift when you read it. The grand cosmic times shrinking into human generations, the divine light dimming into ordinary firelight. And maybe that's why the King List still captures imagination today, because in its own way it tells our story, how humanity went from asking for permission from the heavens to writing its own history. But that journey, as we'll see, didn't erase the gods. It only made them more mysterious. Before we go any further into that clay, though, take a moment. Maybe you're listening in the quiet of your room, or walking somewhere with the night air around you. Wherever you are, this same curiosity that drives you now is the same one that guided those ancient scribes. They too looked at the world and asked where it began, who ruled it first, and why the past always feels bigger than the present. So, while we have electric lights instead of oil lamps, and screens instead of tablets, that shared curiosity connects us across 5,000 years. If you're finding this journey through history a comforting way to drift or unwind, I'd be grateful if you liked the video or subscribed. It helps keep this small space of calm curiosity alive and helps others who might need a quiet moment find their way here too. Now, let's step closer to the clay itself, to those small tablets that hold eternity in their wedge-shaped marks, the ones that whisper stories older than writing, older than memory. Because before we can understand who these kings were, we need to look at what they left behind, and how those fragile fragments of earth still managed to speak across the ages. If you've ever held a lump of clay in your hands, soft and cool, you know it doesn't seem like the sort of thing that could outlast civilizations. It bends easily, carries fingerprints, cracks if forgotten in the sun. And yet, somehow, clay remembers. It remembers better than marble, better than iron, better than ink. Because while stone breaks and paper burns, clay can be reborn in fire. Once it hardens in the heat, it becomes almost immortal. The Sumerians understood that long before anyone else. To them, writing wasn't about decoration or vanity. It was about preserving the truth against time itself. When they pressed their reed styluses into wet clay, they weren't just recording words, they were embedding thought into the bones of the earth, and those bones are still here. The Sumerian King List is one of those memories, baked into permanence. It began as a record, perhaps copied and recopied countless times, until it reached the version we now know from a small fragment of clay found in the ruins of ancient Larsa. It doesn't look impressive at first glance. A palm-sized rectangle of brownish-grey material, slightly curved, the edges chipped, the surface faintly scored with wedge-shaped marks that to an untrained eye might look like scratches. But to someone who can read cuneiform, those marks are language, clear, precise, alive. Each one an echo of a scribe's hand that moved 5,000 years ago, making symbols for names and numbers that defied all reason. When the archaeologists unearthed it, the tablet had been lying buried for millennia. It was one among thousands found in Mesopotamian sites, because the Sumerians and their successors wrote on clay constantly. Legal contracts, school exercises, receipts, hymns, myths, entire libraries pressed into mud. Most of those tablets contain ordinary things, lists of goods, grain deliveries, letters from merchants. But once in a while, something extraordinary slips through. A text that doesn't just record daily life, but reaches for the cosmic. The King List was one of those. When it was translated in the early 1900s, the world learned that the oldest known civilization had once claimed to remember an age of gods who ruled for 200 years. It's an unsettling kind of discovery. because the King List is written with the same tone as all the practical documents of Sumer. There's no sign that the scribe thought he was writing fiction. The writing is neat, the structure methodical, a name, a city, a number of years, and a simple note when the flood comes. Nothing sensational, nothing embellished. The text doesn't try to convince you, it assumes you already know. That calm certainty is part of what makes it so powerful. It's as if the writer were saying, "This is how it was. We remember." There's a quiet irony in that, because memory, at least human memory, fades so quickly. We forget birthdays, names, faces, moments that mattered. But the Sumerians found a way to make memory tangible. They took something as fleeting as speech and gave it physical weight. The clay didn't just preserve their words, it preserved their way of thinking. When you look at a cuneiform tablet today, you're not just reading text. You're looking at the rhythm of someone's hand, the hesitation of a line, the slight angle of a stroke that reveals how that scribe learned his craft. Each tablet is both document and fingerprint. The scribe who made the King List must have been someone of status. Literacy was rare and revered in Sumer. To be trained in writing was to hold a kind of power, the power to fix truth in form. Scribes began their training young, learning to make straight columns of wedges and to copy older texts until the motions became instinctive. They practiced on cheap clay, then graduated to official documents when their work was flawless. Somewhere in that tradition, someone copied a much older text, perhaps reciting names already thousands of years old. He wasn't inventing them. He was preserving them, perhaps for a temple archive or a royal library. Clay tablets weren't meant to be art pieces. They were tools, as utilitarian as parchment ledgers in later centuries. Once filled, they might be dried in the sun or fired in a kiln for permanence. Then they'd be stored in baskets, boxes, or walls of archives. Many were never meant to be read again except in emergencies. Yet thousands of years later we find them still legible, their wedge-shaped marks as sharp as the day they were made. Clay remembers even when no one asks it to. Imagine the scene when that particular tablet of the King List was first found. The dig site buzzing with quiet excitement, the air thick with dust and anticipation. Archaeologists brushing dirt from the surface, noticing the pattern of the lines, realizing what it was. They couldn't have known then that it would become one of the most discussed artifacts in Mesopotamian history. The initial translation must have been startling. Those enormous numbers, the mention of kings before the flood, the sheer audacity of recording history on a divine scale. It would have sounded like science fiction, yet there it was, baked into clay, written long before any of our modern myths were imagined. It's easy to see why that tablet captured so many imaginations. There's something eerie about reading a list that begins with names of beings who lived tens of thousands of years each, followed by an almost casual note about a flood, and then suddenly transitions into names that archaeologists can actually verify through other records. It's like reading a history book that starts with gods and ends with people you could meet. That blending of myth and reality makes it impossible to categorize. It's not legend, not entirely. It's not pure history either. It sits in the space between, that strange borderland where human memory and divine imagination overlap. Some scholars believe that several versions of the King List once existed, compiled and recopied by different city-states across Mesopotamia. Each city had its own pride, its own claim to be the cradle of kingship. Eridu, Kish, Uruk, Ur, each wanted to trace its rulers back to the divine origin. The version we have may be a synthesis of many, created to unify those claims into a single story of succession. If that's true, then the King List wasn't just about memory, it was about legitimacy. To rule in Sumer wasn't merely a political act, it was cosmic inheritance. A king who could trace his line to the antediluvian monarchs could claim authority not just over his people, but over time itself. But even if politics played a role, there's a sincerity in the writing that feels older than propaganda. The Sumerians genuinely saw kingship as a sacred institution. Their word for king, Lugal, literally means great man, but its meaning extended far beyond leadership. A true king was chosen by the gods, charged with maintaining balance, justice, and ritual purity. The King List reflects that worldview. It's not a record of conquests or achievements. It's a genealogy of cosmic order. The flood doesn't just wash away cities, it resets the world's moral and spiritual alignment. That idea of floods as cosmic resets is one of the most enduring in human mythology. The King List predates the biblical flood story by more than 1,000 years, yet the pattern is the same: a world ruled by semi-divine beings, a great deluge that wipes away corruption, and a new era of mortal rulers who inherit a cleansed world. It's hard not to wonder whether that pattern originated here, in the clay of Sumer, and spread outward through the languages and legends that followed. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries later, describes a flood almost identical in detail. The parallels are too close to ignore. Still, there's something more haunting about the King List than any myth. Myths are meant to be told and retold, each generation reshaping them. But this list wasn't meant to be performed. It was meant to be read, or perhaps recited solemnly in temples. There's no moral lesson written between the lines, no dramatic tension. It's dry, matter of fact, and that makes it feel more real. It's like finding a spreadsheet of miracles. When ancient scribes wrote those words, they were creating not entertainment, but record. They didn't seem to doubt that their ancestors had once known kings who lived through epochs. Archaeologists have found more than one copy of the King List. Some are fragmentary, some incomplete, but together they reveal how the text evolved. Over centuries it was updated to include later dynasties, suggesting that Sumerians saw their history as continuous. Time wasn't a closed book for them. It was a scroll that could always be extended. The names of the earliest kings, those who reigned before the flood, remained untouched, as if to remind everyone of the divine origin of power. But after each new age, new rulers were added, until myth and reality wove together seamlessly. When we read the King List today, we do so through the lens of modern skepticism. We separate the supernatural from the historical, the symbolic from the factual. But to the people who wrote it, there was no such separation. Their world was one in which gods walked among humans, where the stars were alive, and where the river could speak if you listened closely enough. Writing was their way of bringing that living world into form. In their minds, clay wasn't just a tool for memory, it was a medium for communion. By pressing their words into earth, they were speaking directly to the gods who made that earth. It's worth remembering that for the Sumerians, the act of writing itself was sacred. The god of writing, Nabu, was seen as a divine scribe who recorded the fate of all beings. Every stroke of the stylus was a ritual act, a collaboration with divinity. When a scribe copied the King List, he wasn't merely preserving history. He was participating in the ongoing order of the cosmos. Each tablet, once finished, was more than an object. It was a vessel of divine memory. That's why it feels fitting that clay, the simplest of materials, would become humanity's first hard drive. Each fragment we unearth today still hums with intent. The marks are physical evidence of a mind reaching across thousands of years saying, "I was here, we were here, remember this." The King List is only one of thousands of such messages, but it happens to be the one that questions the boundary between memory and myth most directly. It asks whether remembering is the same as knowing. Even now, when archaeologists catalogue tablets, they can tell when a text has been handled frequently. The edges are smoothed, the corners polished by fingers over time. The King List fragments show signs of wear, suggesting that generations of scribes may have copied them from earlier models, each introducing small variations but keeping the structure intact. The endurance of the text speaks to its importance. It wasn't a curiosity, it was a cornerstone of identity, and perhaps that's what gives the clay its quiet power. Because when you think about it, Memory itself is a fragile thing. It can crumble under pressure, distort in the heat, fade if left untouched. But when memory is written into clay, it gains weight, substance, endurance. The King List may contain impossibilities, but those impossibilities are now facts of matter. They exist physically in museums and collections. The story may be unbelievable, but the object is real. Clay makes belief tangible. The next time you see a photo of one of those tablets, small, cracked, worn, imagine the hands that made it. Imagine the reed stylus dipping into soft clay, line after line, the sound of quiet scratching as a story older than written history takes shape again. Imagine the pause before the scribe inscribes that phrase, "Then the flood swept over." He may have looked up at the sky for a moment, thinking of the rain or the river or the gods who once ruled, and then he pressed on, steady and unhurried, because to him this wasn't myth or metaphor. It was memory, the clay that remembered when the world was ruled by gods. And just as those ancient hands once shaped the words, so too did later hands uncover them, brush the dust away, and read their meaning anew. The chain of memory never truly broke. The medium changed, from clay to paper, from paper to screen, but the impulse remains the same. To write is to resist forgetting. To record is to defy time. Even now, as we move forward into the deeper mystery of what these records mean, it's worth pausing to recognize the miracle of their survival. Without clay, we might never have known that the Sumerians imagined an age before the flood, or that they counted their kings in tens of thousands of years. Without clay, we would have no bridge between our rational world and theirs. It's a humble material, but it remembers everything we try to forget. The myths, the numbers, the questions that still refuse to fade. And that brings us closer to the heart of the mystery itself. Not the tablet, but the people behind it. Who are these kings whose names echo through the ages? What did their cities look like before the flood came, and what kind of beings were they said to be? To understand the list, we need to step into their world, the first city under the stars, where heaven and earth still shared the same language. If you were to travel back to the beginning of cities, before the idea of civilization had even taken root, you would find yourself standing on the edge of a river plain so vast and flat that the horizon looks like an unbroken line. The air would shimmer with heat by day and cool quickly at dusk, and when night came the stars would hang close and heavy above you. In that stillness you might see faint lights flickering in the distance, torches perhaps, marking the edges of something new, something the world had never seen before. That place was called Eridu. The Sumerians believed it was the first city ever built, the foundation stone of human order, the point where the divine first reached down and gave shape to the world. Archaeologists today describe Eridu as a mound of earth and debris, layers upon layers of settlement stacked across thousands of years. It doesn't look like much at first. Dusty ridges, broken bricks, pottery shards, and the faint outline of walls. But when you dig into that mound, you're digging through time itself. Each layer represents an age, a rebuild, a rebirth of the same sacred space. At the deepest level, they found the remains of a small temple, simple in design, just a raised platform with a few rooms, built over 7,000 years ago. Above it, rebuilt and expanded again and again, rose later temples dedicated to the same god, Enki, the lord of water, wisdom and creation. For the Sumerians, Enki was the architect of order, the one who brought civilization's gifts to humanity. It makes sense that his temple stood at the heart of the first city. Imagine the sound of water in that landscape. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers were capricious things, overflowing unpredictably, shaping and reshaping the plains. The people who lived there learned early that survival depended on controlling the flow. Canals became lifelines, linking fields to rivers, villages to temples. Eridu grew around those waterways, a network of mud brick homes and courtyards connected by narrow lanes. Smoke from cooking fires drifted upward at dawn. Children fetched water from the canals. Priests tended offerings at the temple, pouring libations to keep the gods content. To us it might look simple, primitive even, but to the people of that time it was the centre of the world. They called it the place where kingship descended from heaven. In Sumerian belief, cities weren't just human creations, they were reflections of cosmic design. Each one had a divine patron, a god or goddess who embodied its character and destiny. Eridu belonged to Enki, the god of deep waters and clever solutions. His presence was said to live within the temple, and from there his influence spread through the city, into the rivers, and out into the world. Every canal, every harvest, every law had a divine origin. Civilization itself was sacred. When the King List says that kingship descended from heaven and was first established in Eridu, it's describing not a metaphor but an event, the moment when divine order took human form. That's why the first name on the King List is Alulim. According to the text, Alulim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. He wasn't described as a god exactly, but as something between, a being chosen by the gods to govern humanity. After him came Alalgar, who ruled for 36,000 years. To us those numbers are impossible, absurd even. But to the Sumerians they were expressions of perfection. The number 60 held divine significance, representing completeness, and the reigns of the early kings are all multiples of 60. Each number was both a duration and a symbol of cosmic balance. In that sense, the first city wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a living calendar, a reflection of eternity measured in human terms. It's easy to forget how small the world was then. A few thousand people at most lived in Eridu's earliest days. There were no vast armies, no sprawling empires. The great inventions we take for granted, writing, the wheel, bronze, were still in their infancy. And yet, the people who lived there saw themselves as participants in a divine story. Their kings weren't conquerors. They were caretakers of order, responsible for keeping the boundary between heaven and earth intact. To rule badly wasn't just political failure, it was cosmic disruption. That belief would define Mesopotamian thought for thousands of years to come. Archaeological layers tell a silent version of this story. The lower levels of Eridu show simple mud brick structures, but as centuries passed they became more elaborate. The temple expanded, platforms rose higher, and new rooms appeared for rituals, offerings and gatherings. You can trace the city's growth like rings in a tree trunk. Each generation built upon the last, not erasing the old, but honouring it by building directly on top of it. The Temple of Enki was rebuilt at least 16 times in the same place. That persistence shows how deeply rooted their faith was. The same spot remained sacred across millennia. To walk through that city in its prime would have been to step into a world organised around the temple, the air thick with incense and the smell of baked clay, the sound of reeds rustling by the canals, cattle lowing in pens, traders calling out prices in the market. Everywhere, symbols of Enki's domain, water jars, fish carvings, reed bundles, reminders that the god's presence sustained every part of life. The temple itself would have shimmered under the sun, plastered and painted, its walls covered in offerings and inscriptions. Inside, priests would recite hymns that connected the cycles of the rivers to the rhythms of the heavens. It's worth noting that the Sumerians saw their world not as flat and lifeless, but as animated by divine intelligence. Rivers had spirits, winds carried the breath of gods. Even the clay beneath their feet held meaning. So when they built a city, they weren't just making shelter. They were aligning themselves with the universe. The temple at Eridu wasn't merely a building, it was a cosmic centre, a meeting point between realms. The ziggurat form that would later define Mesopotamian architecture, those stepped towers reaching toward the sky, began here, in the impulse to create a bridge between earth and heaven. That impulse might explain why Eridu became the symbolic first city, even if there were other early settlements around the same time. In the collective Sumerian imagination, it wasn't just the oldest, it was the beginning of civilization itself. Other cities might rise and fall, but Eridu was eternal. When the King List records it as the place where kingship first descended, it's capturing that reverence. It's saying, before there were nations, before there were borders, before the flood itself, there was Eridu, the city built under the stars. Those stars meant everything to the Sumerians. They looked to them for signs, for patterns, for the will of the gods. Their priests became some of the earliest astronomers, charting the paths of Venus, Jupiter, and the moon. They saw the heavens not as distant, but as an active realm that influenced daily life. That's why kingship and starlight were intertwined. A king's legitimacy wasn't just political, it was cosmic, written in the alignment of celestial bodies. To govern well was to be in harmony with the sky. To govern poorly was to invite chaos. The Temple of Enki at Eridu wasn't only a house for worship, it was an observatory, a place where the divine order of the heavens could be studied and reflected on earth. When we think about those early people standing on rooftops at night, watching constellations drift across the dark, it's easy to imagine how their minds reached upward. The sky was the only vastness they knew. Every point of light was a mystery, every movement a message. To them, the gods didn't live in some unreachable realm. They were visible, their presence written across the stars. That belief would later shape the myths of the Anunnaki, those divine figures who, according to Sumerian texts, once walked among men and taught them the arts of civilization. The King List, though sober in tone, carries the echo of that idea. Its earliest kings, the ones who ruled for thousands of years, were remembered as beings of mixed nature, part divine, part human, living embodiments of the boundary between heaven and earth. Eridu's story, in many ways, is the story of that boundary. Every flood, every rebuild, every dynasty that claimed its heritage there was repeating the same pattern: descent, rule, destruction, renewal. It's a pattern that became the rhythm of Mesopotamian history. The King List is simply the written form of that cycle, a record of how the divine slowly became human, how time itself shortened, how eternity was divided into generations. When you walk through the ruins of Eridu today, the silence feels almost deliberate, as if the earth is still holding its breath, still listening for the sound of a god returning. But Eridu wasn't alone for long. As centuries passed, other cities emerged: Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Kish, each claiming its own divine connection. The centre of kingship shifted from one city to another, following the tides of power and faith. The King List tracks that movement like a river flowing through time. After Eridu came Bad Tibera, then Lerak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city received kingship from heaven. Each ruled for tens of thousands of years before the flood finally washed the world clean. The story expands outward, but Eridu remains its source, its heart. Every city that followed carried a piece of its legacy, as though they were fragments of the same divine blueprint. If you were to stand in Eridu on a quiet night, far from the noise of the modern world, and look up at the same stars the Sumerians once watched, you might feel that connection still. The constellations haven't changed. The riverbeds might have shifted, the temples crumbled, but the sky remains the same. The same pattern of light that guided their priests still burns overhead. Somewhere among those stars, they believed, the gods had once looked down and chosen this place as the first seat of kingship. It's not hard to see why. There's a kind of symmetry to it. The meeting of heaven and earth reflected in the surface of the river, the city built where the divine first touched the soil. And yet, even as we reconstruct that world, we're still only seeing fragments. Most of Eridu's secrets remain buried. Only a handful of its temples and houses have been excavated. The rest lies beneath layers of earth, waiting. Archaeology moves slowly, carefully, sifting through time grain by grain. The story of Eridu is far from complete, but the parts we do know already change how we understand human beginnings. Civilization didn't start with conquest or technology. It started with belief. The belief that order comes from above, that the universe has structure, and that humans have a place within it. That belief would carry through every line of the King List. It's why the text isn't just a record of who ruled. It's a cosmic chart, mapping how divinity translated into governance, how the stars above reflected the rulers below. When the Sumerians said that kingship descended from heaven, they weren't describing a mythic visitation. They were describing the natural order of existence as they understood it. Authority wasn't invented by humans, it was inherited from the gods. As Eridu's influence faded, that idea didn't die. It simply moved from one city to the next, from Sumer to Akkad, from Babylon to Assyria, carried forward through empires and religions. Even today, echoes of it survive in phrases like divine right of kings, or the notion that leaders rule by destiny rather than chance. It all began here, in this first city under the stars, where people believed that heaven itself had once placed its crown upon human heads. And maybe that's the quiet truth hidden in the clay, that the Sumerians, in their way, were trying to bridge two worlds. They built their cities not only to protect themselves from floods and famine, but to mirror the order of the cosmos. Their kings weren't just rulers, they were reflections of something eternal. The King List is their attempt to capture that reflection before it faded completely into myth. But of course, time doesn't stop. Floods came and went, cities rose and fell, and memory began to blur. The first kings, those who ruled for tens of thousands of years, became figures of legend. The flood that separated their world from ours became the great divider of history. And in that moment of transition, when the waters came and erased the old world, something profound happened. The divine order slipped from heaven to earth once more, and humanity began its long reign under mortal skies. That is where the King List turns next, from the first city that birthed kingship to the flood that swept it all away. A flood that didn't just drown cities but reset time itself, leaving behind only fragments of memory written in clay. When you read the Sumerian King List, there's a moment where everything you think you know about time begins to lose its footing. You followed the line of names from the first city, Eridu, and suddenly the numbers stop making sense. Kings who ruled for 28,800 years, another for 36,000, another for 43,200. The rhythm of the text remains the same, matter-of-fact and confident, but the scale becomes almost cosmic. It's as if the scribe were describing not reigns but eras, vast stretches of existence when the world itself might have felt different. These were the kings before the flood, the antediluvian rulers, half divine, half human, and entirely beyond comprehension. The list names 8 of them. Their cities are small by modern standards, yet in the ancient imagination they were more than cities. They were the pillars of creation, each one a place where the gods and humans met in open exchange. The first was Eridu, ruled by Alulim. Then came Bad Tibira, ruled by Alalgar. After that, Larak, Sippar and Shuruppak. Each king took the throne as kingship descended from heaven once again, passed from city to city like a torch carried through eternity. The text doesn't explain how these successions happened. It doesn't describe wars or treaties or the founding of dynasties. It simply states that kingship moved, that it was given, withdrawn, and given again, as though by divine decision. That phrase alone tells you what kind of story this is. It isn't a history of power, it's a theology of time. When we hear the word antediluvian, we think of legends, Atlantis, lost continents, gods walking the earth. But for the Sumerians, this period was not fantasy. It was the first act of history. To them, these kings were real, and their reigns measured the rhythm of the cosmos itself. Each one represented a divine phase, a calibration of order before the flood reset everything. The King List treats their reigns with the same precision that a modern historian might use to record dynasties. There's a strange humility in that, the belief that even the acts of gods can be catalogued, organised, and understood if written correctly. It's easy to see why those names fascinated later generations. The numbers alone invite speculation. Alulim, the first king, ruled for 28,800 years, precisely 8 times 3600. Alalgar, who followed, ruled for 36,000 years, 10 times 3600. The number 3600, or 60 squared, appears again and again. 60 was sacred to the Sumerians. It was the base of their numerical system, the foundation of their mathematics, their astronomy, even their measure of time. They divided the day into 12 double hours, each with 60 minutes, each minute 60 seconds. They saw beauty in that symmetry. It's possible that these vast reigns were not literal but symbolic, expressions of divine perfection rather than solar years. Still, the precision suggests intention. Someone designed these numbers carefully. They weren't random exaggerations, they were equations written as history. If you think about it, that fits the Sumerian worldview. They saw the universe as a network of measurable forces, not chaos, but pattern. Their gods didn't act on whims, they governed through laws, decrees, and calculations. To them, divine rule was not magical, it was administrative. And so, the King List presents the rule of these pre-flood kings as a kind of divine bureaucracy stretching across ages. Each ruler's reign fulfills its numerical term, then passes authority onward like a cosmic relay. Even the flood that ends their world arrives not as punishment, but as transition, the end of one accounting period and the beginning of another. Still, it's hard not to wonder how those names and numbers survived at all. If these kings truly lived before the flood, how did their memory endure? The Sumerians claimed that kingship, and by extension memory, descended from heaven again after the waters receded. That's a powerful metaphor, the idea that history itself has divine origins, that remembering is an act of grace. It suggests that the King List wasn't just a record, but a restoration. The scribes weren't inventing the past. They were recovering it, piecing together fragments of a story that humanity had almost lost. Archaeologists have long debated whether there might be a kernel of historical truth buried inside that mythic frame. Could there have been real figures, ancient chiefs or proto-kings, whose memories stretched through oral tradition until they became godlike? Some think so. They point to the continuity of settlement in Mesopotamia, to the flood layers found in ancient cities like Shuruppak and Ur. Those layers show evidence of a massive inundation around 2900 BCE, a regional catastrophe that could have inspired flood legends across the Near East. Perhaps the King List's antediluvian section preserves a distant echo of those early societies, magnified through generations of storytelling. Others see the numbers as deliberate symbolism, not exaggeration. The total of all pre-flood reigns adds up to 241,200 years, a number so precise it seems chosen for meaning. Divide it by 3600, the sacred Tsar, and you get 67, exactly the number of lunar cycles in a 6-year period. To the Sumerians, who tracked time by the moon, that correspondence might have carried cosmic weight. It's as though they encoded the harmony of the heavens into the lengths of divine rule. The King List, then, becomes not a chronology, but a calendar, a map of celestial order written in the language of kingship. Of course, not everyone reads it that way. For those who see the text through a literal lens, the King List hints at something far stranger. Some suggest it's evidence that the Sumerians remembered beings who weren't human at all. The Anunnaki, those mysterious gods or visitors described in later myths. If that sounds far-fetched, consider that the Sumerians themselves made little distinction between their gods and their rulers. The earliest kings were described as chosen by the gods, sometimes as their direct offspring. They built temples rather than palaces. Their duty was to mediate between heaven and earth, not to conquer or expand. That blend of divinity and humanity leaves room for endless speculation about what those ancient people thought they were recording. But whether one takes the myth literally or symbolically, it's clear that the Sumerians saw these pre-flood kings as more than mortals. They were archetypes, embodiments of perfect rule. Each one represented an aspect of divine order, wisdom, justice, fertility, craftsmanship. In that sense, their impossibly long reigns weren't exaggerations, but expressions of timelessness. They didn't just rule the land, they ruled epochs. And when the flood finally came, it didn't just drown their cities, it washed away an entire age of perfection. It's striking how consistent this pattern is across other ancient traditions. In the Hebrew Bible, patriarchs before the flood lived for hundreds of years. In Egyptian lists, early rulers are described as gods and demigods reigning for thousands. In India's Vedic cosmology, human history unfolds through yugas lasting tens of thousands of years. Even in Greek mythology, the ages of gods and heroes precede the age of ordinary men. The Sumerian King List is simply the oldest written version of that universal pattern. The idea that before our frail, brief lives, there was a time when beings closer to the divine walked the earth. What's remarkable is how specific the Sumerians were. They didn't speak vaguely of golden ages or times of gods. They listed names, cities, and exact durations. Alulim of Eridu, 28th of the 800 years. Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000. Enmenluana of Bad Tibira, 43,200. Enmengalana of Bad Tibira, 28,800. Dumuzid, the shepherd of Bad Tibira, 36,000. Ensipaziana of Larak, 28,800. Enmedurana of Sipar, 21,000. Ubaratutu of Shurupak, 18,600. Then the flood. The rhythm of those numbers feels deliberate, almost musical. Each reign shorter than the last, each city closer to the flood, as if the divine presence were slowly withdrawing from the world. That gradual decline is more than narrative structure, it's cosmology. The Sumerians believed that as divine energy moved farther from heaven, the world became more unstable. The gods' influence weakened, human error grew, and finally the balance broke. The flood was both destruction and purification, a necessary reset. Afterward, kingship would descend from heaven again, but it would never be the same. The new kings would live and die as humans do. Time itself would contract. The infinite would become finite. You can almost feel the melancholy in that transition. The King List doesn't lament it, the text is too formal for emotion, but it implies a sense of loss. The world after the flood is smaller, dimmer, mortal. Yet the memory of those early kings persists, carved into clay as if to defy the erosion of divinity. It's tempting to think the Sumerians were already nostalgic for a paradise they never truly knew, a time when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin. If you imagine those first kings as real, what kind of beings might they have been? The myths describe them as taller, wiser, radiant with divine presence. They were said to possess knowledge of agriculture, law, and astronomy, gifts that later humans inherited. The god Enki, patron of Eridu, was often portrayed as their guide, teaching them how to manage rivers and measure fields. Perhaps these stories were the Sumerians' way of honouring their ancestors, the innovators who turned scattered villages into organised cities. Over centuries their names could have grown into legend. The line between human and god might have blurred until memory became mythology. And yet, there's another layer to all this. The arithmetic of belief. Those reigns, measured in tens of thousands of years, might represent not lifetimes but cosmic cycles, ages of stability followed by upheaval. The Sumerians divided time into great units called sars and nirs and sosses, 3600, 600 and 60 years respectively. Each one was a mathematical expression of cosmic rhythm. The King List could be read as a record of how many such cycles each divine ruler presided over. When you view it that way, the numbers start to make sense within their own logic. The kings before the flood were not individuals so much as epochs personified. Still, for the modern reader, the allure of the literal remains. The sheer precision of the text invites it. It's difficult to dismiss such consistency as random exaggeration. You can see why later thinkers, from ancient historians to modern theorists, have wondered if the Sumerians were recording memories of an advanced civilization, perhaps even visitors from elsewhere. Whether you believe that or not, it's a testament to the King List's power that it continues to provoke those questions 5,000 years later. It refuses to sit quietly in the Museum of Myth. It demands to be interpreted, decoded, argued over. When you look at the clay tablet itself, though, the mystery becomes oddly grounded. The marks are small, orderly, deliberate. There's nothing wild or mystical about them. They were made by a human hand, probably in a quiet room, perhaps while a teacher dictated from an older copy. The scribe might have paused to dip his stylus in water, turned the tablet in his fingers, and continued pressing those careful wedges into the clay. To him, these were not fantastical stories. They were tradition, inheritance, truth. He was continuing a record that stretched back beyond memory, and in doing so he ensured that the names of Alulim, Alalgar, and all the others would outlive both his world and ours. It's strange to think how different our view of time is. For us, thousands of years feel unimaginable. We speak of centuries as vast spans, of millennia as eternity. For the Sumerians, eternity was measurable. It could be divided into sars and nears, written in columns, counted like barley. Time wasn't infinite, it was organised. That's what the King List teaches more than anything, that even the divine can be systematised. It's both humbling and unsettling. And yet, beneath all the structure, there's still wonder. Those early kings, whether real or symbolic, represent humanity's first attempt to map its own origins. They stand at the edge of myth and history, looking both forward and back. When the Sumerians wrote their names, they were reaching into the unknown, trying to remember a time before forgetting. Maybe that's why the King List has survived. It speaks to something universal, our refusal to let the past dissolve completely, our need to believe that once, long ago, the world was larger, slower, and filled with beings who understood its secrets better than we do now. Soon, the flood will come in their story, washing away everything they built, erasing even the memory of their reigns. But not yet. For now, the kings before the flood still sit on their thrones in the calm of prehistory, their reigns stretching across the ages, their names preserved in clay. They wait in that timeless space between myth and history, between the world as it was and the world that would begin again after the waters receded. And as the line of their names ends with Ubaratutu of Shurupak, the King List falls silent for a moment, then writes the sentence that changes everything. Then the flood swept over. With those words, the age of gods ends, and the age of humanity begins. But before we step into that new world, it's worth pausing on this precipice between eras. Because what happens next isn't just a flood of water, it's a flood of meaning, a transformation of time itself. The deluge will erase, but it will also renew. The divine will retreat, and memory will start again from zero. The clay that remembered the kings before the flood will also remember their end. The story of the flood begins quietly. It doesn't announce itself with thunder or divine anger, at least not in the way later versions do. In the Sumerian King List, it arrives in a single line, unadorned, simple, absolute. Then the flood swept over. 4 words that erase everything that came before. The kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, the cities they built, the temples that reached for the heavens, all vanish beneath that sentence. No explanation, no drama, no description of the rain or the screams or the collapse. Just the statement that the world changed and time began again. For archaeologists, that sentence is more than myth. Buried beneath the cities of southern Mesopotamia, they have found layers of sediment, thick bands of river silt lying between layers of human habitation. In places like Shurupak, Ur and Kish, those flood layers mark a sudden break in continuity. One civilization ends and another begins above it. The dating isn't uniform. The floods didn't happen everywhere at once. But the evidence is there. A period of inundation sometime around 2900 BCE, when rising rivers swallowed towns and reshaped the land. To those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of the world. And perhaps it was, in their sense, not the end of existence, but the end of one order and the birth of another. To understand what the flood meant to the Sumerians, you have to imagine how intimately they lived with water. The rivers were both lifeline and threat. Their floods nourished the soil but could just as easily destroy it. The difference between abundance and famine was often measured in inches of rainfall or the timing of the seasonal rise. When they built their canals and levees, they weren't just engineering projects, they were acts of worship. Keeping the water under control meant keeping the gods appeased. So when the flood came beyond control, it would have felt like divine withdrawal, the moment when heaven stopped listening. In Sumerian myth, the flood isn't described as punishment in the moral sense. It's more like a reset, a recalibration of the cosmos. The gods had grown weary of the noise of humanity, according to later retellings in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis myth. The world had become crowded, chaotic, unbalanced. Enlil, the lord of wind and authority, decided to cleanse it. But one god, Enki, the same patron of Eridu, disagreed. He saw potential in humanity and warned a man named Ziusudra, or Utnapishtim in later Akkadian versions, to build a boat and preserve life. The King List doesn't name Ziusudra directly, but the connection is unmistakable. The last king before the flood, Ubaratutu of Shuruppak, is described elsewhere as Ziusudra's father. That detail bridges the King List and the myth. It suggests that the flood wasn't just a story about divine wrath. It was also about continuity. Even in destruction, memory was preserved. Ziusudra survives, instructed by Enki, carrying with him the seeds of renewal. After the waters recede, kingship descends from heaven again. The world starts over. When you picture that event through the eyes of the ancient Sumerians, it becomes less a supernatural disaster and more a historical trauma encoded into myth. Imagine the rivers swelling beyond their banks, the fields disappearing under brown water, the temples collapsing, the crops rotting in the mud. Families clinging to boats or rooftops watching the horizon vanish. To the survivors, such a flood would not have seemed natural. It would have felt cosmic, as if the very fabric of order had dissolved. And when the waters finally receded, the survivors would have faced a world both familiar and alien. Same soil, same sun, but stripped of the structures that gave life meaning. That's what makes the brevity of the King List line so powerful. It's not poetic understatement. It's the silence of trauma turned into ritual language. The scribe doesn't describe the flood because he doesn't need to. Everyone in Mesopotamia knew what floods meant. They lived with that danger every year. The difference between ordinary flooding and the Great Flood wasn't one of kind, but of scale. The same force that gave life, taken to its extreme. So when the text says, "Then the flood swept over," it's not just a sentence. It's a cultural memory compressed into 4 words. When modern readers encounter flood myths, it's tempting to separate them into categories: moral allegory, geological memory, or borrowed tradition. But in Sumer, those categories didn't exist. Myth and memory were one. The flood wasn't something that happened once and ended. It was part of the world's rhythm, destruction followed by renewal. Every time the rivers rose, the Sumerians were reminded that their civilization stood on borrowed time. Every year they rebuilt, reseeded, reasserted order. The King List simply extends that cycle to its cosmic extreme. One ultimate flood that ended the divine age and began the human one. In that sense, the flood isn't just an event, it's a metaphor for time itself. It divides eternity into before and after, into mythic and historical. Before the flood, kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, blending with gods. After the flood, reigns shortened to human scales. Mortality enters the equation. The divine doesn't vanish, but it withdraws, leaving humans to manage the balance on their own. Civilization becomes the art of resisting chaos. There's a quiet genius in how the King List transitions through that divide. It doesn't treat the flood as the end of the story, it treats it as punctuation, the colon between two eras. The text pauses, then continues. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, Kish became the seat of kingship. That sentence alone encapsulates the Sumerian worldview. History doesn't begin with creation, it begins with restoration. Kingship isn't invented, it's reinstated. Humanity doesn't rebel against the gods, it inherits their work. Archaeological evidence supports that rhythm of destruction and renewal. The flood layers that mark the end of early settlements are followed by new, more organised cities. Writing appears soon after. Administration expands. It's as if the trauma of the flood pushed survivors to create stronger systems, to document more carefully, to assert control through record keeping. Out of catastrophe came bureaucracy, the very thing that defined civilization. Maybe that's why the Sumerians saw the flood not as a tragedy but as a reset. It didn't destroy civilization, it demanded its perfection. The myths echo that optimism in their own way. When Ziusudra emerges from his boat after the flood, he offers sacrifices to the gods. The aroma pleases them, and they grant him eternal life in a distant land. The world is cleansed, the covenant renewed. Humanity is smaller now, more fragile, but also wiser. The flood isn't vengeance, it's calibration. It sets limits. It reminds both gods and humans of their roles. Enlil learns restraint, Enki gains vindication, and humans learn gratitude. That dynamic between divine authority, divine wisdom, and human obedience becomes the foundation of Mesopotamian religion for millennia. You can sense the echo of that structure in the King List's composition. Its purpose wasn't merely to record reigns, it was to map the flow of divine legitimacy across time. The flood sits at its centre like a hinge, dividing the age of impossibility from the age of realism. Before the flood, reigns are vast and cosmic. After, they are human and historical. That shift marks the birth of chronology as we know it. History becomes something that can be measured. Still, the flood simplicity in the King List conceals how deeply it shapes Sumerian consciousness. The very act of writing history implies the memory of loss. You only begin to record the past once you realise it can disappear. The flood gave the Sumerians that awareness. It showed them that the world could be erased, that order was fragile, that memory itself could drown. From that point on, every tablet, every inscription, every act of writing becomes an act of defiance, a way of saying, we remember. Some scholars have suggested that the Sumerian flood myth might preserve fragments of older memories, perhaps a real geological event, a sudden rise in sea level at the end of the last ice age, or the breaching of natural dams that flooded the Persian Gulf. Whether or not that's true, the resonance of the story suggests it spoke to something universal. Every culture born near rivers carries flood myths. Water is both creator and destroyer, an elemental force that erases boundaries. It's easy to see how the Sumerians, living between two unpredictable rivers, would have turned that duality into theology. But beyond the physical and symbolic, there's also a psychological dimension. The flood represents forgetting. It's the collective amnesia between civilizations, the gap where knowledge is lost and rediscovered. When the King List says, the flood swept over, it might be describing not only a deluge of water, but a deluge of time, an interruption in continuity. Everything that came before becomes myth, and everything that follows becomes history. The flood is the border between memory and mystery, and perhaps that's why the King List treats it so briefly. You can't describe the act of forgetting, you can only acknowledge it. The flood is the silence between eras, the blank space in the record. After it, the world reboots, the names start again, the numbers shrink, and the divine begins to fade into legend. Yet the old names remain at the beginning of the list. like ghosts haunting the margins of history. If you think of the King List as a human document rather than a divine one, it becomes a story of survival. The flood wiped away most of what was, but the survivors carried memory forward in fragments. Names, numbers, stories, rituals. Those fragments became the foundation of everything that followed. Each generation rebuilt from what little it remembered. Over time, those memories hardened into myth, then into record. The flood didn't erase history. It forced humanity to create it. It's a pattern that repeats endlessly. Civilizations rise, collapse, and rebuild, each time telling themselves that this version will last forever. The Sumerians understood that cycle better than most. They lived on land that could both sustain and destroy them in the same season. The flood wasn't a metaphor to them. It was reality woven into daily life. Every canal they dug, every levee they built, every offering they made was an attempt to keep the waters, literal and cosmic, at bay. The flood was always waiting just beyond the horizon. And yet, there's something quietly hopeful in how they wrote about it. They never ended the story with destruction. The flood always gives way to renewal. The King List continues immediately, almost impatiently, as if to say that even when the world ends, it must begin again. That insistence on continuity might be the most human part of all. The Sumerians didn't just survive the flood, they turned it into structure. They gave chaos a date, a place in the record, and by doing so, they took control of it. Today, when we look back at the flood through the lens of science, we can trace its outlines in sediment and geology. But the Sumerians didn't need scientific proof. They carried the memory of it in their collective consciousness. They understood that water erases but also preserves. The same silt that buried their cities kept their tablets intact for millennia. The same flood that destroyed their temples made the soil fertile again. That duality, destruction and preservation, loss and continuity, runs through their entire worldview. You can see it even now in the remains of their cities. Layers of civilization stacked atop one another, flood silt between them like pages in a book. Each layer marks an ending and a beginning, a physical manifestation of the myth. The flood was not a single event. It was a pattern carved into the land itself. Every time a city was rebuilt after a flood, its people were reenacting the same story. Chaos, destruction, renewal. The King List simply compressed that eternal cycle into one monumental event that divided heaven's kings from humanity's rulers. It's strange to realize that this ancient myth, written in wedge-shaped marks on clay 5,000 years ago, still echoes through our culture. We still tell stories of great floods, of cleansings, of worlds destroyed and reborn. Whether in religion, literature or film, the flood remains a metaphor for the end and beginning of everything. The Sumerians gave us that template. They gave us the language to describe catastrophe and recovery in the same breath. And as the King List moves beyond the flood, it doesn't dwell on what was lost. It looks forward, to the return of kingship, to the rebuilding of order. It tells us that after the waters receded, heaven once again granted authority to the earth. This time to Kish, a city destined to begin the human chapter of history. The gods, it seems, had not abandoned the world. They had simply washed it clean. And so, the story continues, flowing from the silence of the flood into the noise of civilization returning. The divine reign has ended, but its reflection lingers in the hands of mortal kings. The clay will remember their names too. When the waters finally receded, what remained was silence. The world that rose from the flood was a clean slate. The same rivers, the same sky, but the familiar landmarks gone. Cities erased, fields flattened, the soil stripped bare and then covered again in a new layer of silt. It must have looked, to those who survived, like the gods had pressed the world's reset button, and perhaps that was the point. The Sumerians believed the flood didn't destroy creation, it renewed it. It washed away corruption and excess, clearing space for something different, something smaller, human, and measurable. After the deluge, kingship descended from heaven again, but this time it was changed. The long, impossible reigns of the divine era were over. The new kings were mortals, and time itself seemed to shrink to fit their lifespan. The King List describes this transition in a way that's almost bureaucratic. The tone doesn't shift, but the numbers do. Where once a single reign spanned 36,000 years, now it barely reaches a few hundred. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, Kish became the seat of kingship. Just like that, history resumes. The divine age ends and the human age begins. The names that follow are still ancient, but they sound more familiar. Enmenpreyesi, Aga, Etena. Men of power, builders of walls, founders of dynasties. They are closer to us in both time and nature. They lived, they ruled, they died. Their rule can be traced in ruins and inscriptions, not just myth. Humanity, it seems, had taken its place on the throne. Kish was the first city to hold kingship after the flood, according to the text. Located north of ancient Babylon, it sat near the edge of the Euphrates River, commanding fertile plains and vital trade routes. Archaeologists have identified it with the modern site of Tel al-Uhaymir, where thousands of clay tablets and foundations of temples have been unearthed. Those layers tell a story of a thriving urban centre emerging soon after the great flood layer that covered earlier settlements. If Eridu symbolised the divine beginnings of civilization, Kish represented its rebirth under human hands. It's fitting that Kish was chosen, at least symbolically, as the first city of the New World. It was a place of bridges, between north and south, between Sumer and Akkad, between divine heritage and human authority. The King List phrasing suggests that kingship didn't evolve from the flood survivors, but rather descended again from heaven. That's an important distinction. It means that authority, even after the deluge, was still seen as a divine gift. The gods had not abandoned humanity. They had re-established the old order in a purified world. But the terms had changed. The kings were no longer immortal. Their reigns were no longer cosmic in scale. The gift of kingship was now conditional. Humanity would rule, but under the watchful eyes of the gods. This shift from mythic to mortal time is one of the most profound transitions in human storytelling. Before the flood, kings were symbols of eternity. After it, they became historical figures. That change mirrors the birth of written history itself. Writing, which had begun as temple accounting, became a tool for legacy. Kings wanted their deeds recorded, their conquests, their temples, their laws. The flood created a new kind of awareness, that life was fleeting, and that memory required preservation. The Sumerians responded by carving time into clay. Their kings may not have ruled for thousands of years, but their words could. In this new world, the relationship between gods and men also changed. The divine still hovered close, but it no longer shared the same space. The gods withdrew to their temples, to their own realms, and kings became intermediaries rather than incarnations. The flood had drawn a line between heaven and earth that could not be crossed so easily again. Yet, in a sense, that made the bond stronger. The new kings ruled not as gods, but as representatives of divine order. Their legitimacy came from ritual, law, and continuity. They maintained balance through offerings and justice, not through immortality. Kish's early kings reflect that balance. The King List names Etana as one of its most significant rulers, describing him as the shepherd who ascended to heaven and consolidated all the foreign lands. His story survives in a separate myth, known as the Legend of Etana, one of the earliest pieces of narrative literature ever recorded. In it, Etana seeks the plant of birth to grant him an heir. To find it, he befriends an eagle and flies with it to heaven. The journey nearly kills him, but it also affirms his divine favour. Etana is both a man and a symbol, the first mortal to bridge the gap between heaven and earth after the flood. His ascent mirrors the Sumerian belief that human kingship was still connected to the divine, even if the gods no longer walked among men. That story, like the King List itself, blends the ordinary and the extraordinary so seamlessly that it's impossible to separate them. Etana could have been a real king whose memory absorbed mythic qualities over centuries, or he could have been a mythic figure retroactively placed in a historical framework. For the Sumerians, there was no contradiction in that. Reality and myth were two layers of the same truth. The flood had not erased that worldview, it had refined it. The gods were still present, but through symbols, rituals, and the authority of kings who carried their names in their titles. The reigns that follow Etana in the King List show a gradual contraction of time. The numbers become more realistic, the tone more grounded. The divine grandeur of the pre-flood era fades into the rhythm of dynastic succession. We begin to see the outline of early city-states, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, each claiming kingship as the divine right of its ruler. This rotation of authority from one city to another reflects not just political shifts, but cosmic rhythm. Kingship was never static. It was something that moved, descending upon one city and then lifting away to another when its time was done. To the Sumerians, that wasn't instability. It was divine design. Each city's rise and fall was part of the larger cycle of balance. After Kish, the King List records the transfer of kingship to Iana, the temple precinct of Uruk, where Gilgamesh's name eventually appears. This marks another key transformation, from divine descent to heroic ambition. The kings after the flood are still chosen by the gods, but they must earn their place through deeds. They are warriors, builders, poets. Their stories are human, full of pride and failure. It's as if the flood had humbled the world. The gods no longer gifted eternity. They demanded effort. The age of passive divinity gave way to the age of active humanity. The flood's legacy can be traced not only in Sumerian texts, but in how the Sumerians structured their entire worldview afterward. Temples became replicas of the cosmic order, designed to maintain harmony between heaven and earth. Laws were introduced to preserve justice, which they saw as divine balance in human form. The first written codes, centuries later under Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi, trace their roots back to this idea that human governance was an extension of divine law. The flood had redefined the human role, not as equal to the gods, but as stewards of their creation. Even the landscape bore traces of this new order. The rivers that once destroyed now became the arteries of civilization. Canals expanded, linking city to city. Trade flourished. The flood's silt enriched the soil, allowing for surplus and growth. The very force that once wiped out the world now sustained it. It's hard not to see that as part of the Sumerian genius, their ability to turn catastrophe into structure. They never tried to forget the flood. They incorporated it into their story of resilience. Every harvest, every ritual, every tablet written in clay was an act of gratitude to the gods who allowed the world to continue. One of the most remarkable things about the King List's post-flood section is how it treats human rulers with the same gravity it gave to the divine ones. The tone doesn't change. The same formula, name, city, reign, continues without pause. The difference is only in scale. This suggests that the Sumerians didn't see the flood as a break in meaning, only in proportion. The divine and the human were part of the same continuum, differing only in duration. The gods ruled for tens of thousands of years, humans for hundreds, but both participated in the same cosmic pattern. The flood didn't separate them completely. It calibrated their relationship. That calibration became the foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerians built their cities with an acute awareness of their fragility. They knew the rivers could rise again. They knew empires could vanish overnight. Their answer wasn't despair, but ritual precision. They recorded everything. Grain yields, temple donations, omens, dreams. Knowledge became their ark, the vessel that would carry memory through future floods. Writing itself, born from temple administration, became sacred. The clay tablets that survived long after their walls fell were, in a way, their second creation, a safeguard against the next deluge, whether of water or time, and in that sense the post-flood kings were more than rulers. They were keepers of memory. Their duty wasn't to live forever, but to ensure continuity. Each one inherited not just a throne, but a cosmic responsibility, to maintain order, to keep the gods appeased, and to leave the world slightly more stable than they found it. The divine kings of old embodied perfection, the human kings embodied endurance. It's fascinating how seamlessly the Sumerian worldview accommodates both despair and optimism. The flood destroyed everything, yet the very next line in their record is about renewal. That's a pattern we still follow. After every collapse, humans rebuild. After every loss, we find a way to continue. The Sumerians didn't invent that resilience, but they were the first to write it down. In their world, even destruction had purpose. The flood wasn't the end of the world, it was the beginning of history. By the time we reach the later sections of the King List, the mythic tone has almost disappeared. The names correspond to archaeological sites, inscriptions, and real political shifts. But the memory of the flood lingers in the structure itself. Every transfer of kingship, every rise and fall of cities, is a miniature echo of that first great cycle. The flood became a metaphor for time's flow, unpredictable, unstoppable, cleansing. If you stand in the ruins of Kish today, you might not see much at first. Just dusty mounds, fragments of bricks, and traces of walls that once bordered canals long since filled with sand. But beneath your feet lies the memory of the first cities after the flood, the first people to rebuild order from ruin. The ground itself remembers, in layers of clay, the continuity of human effort. Somewhere in that soil, among tablets and artifacts, lies the story of the moment humanity accepted its place in the divine hierarchy, not as gods, but as their descendants charged with keeping balance alive. The Sumerians never claimed perfection after the flood. They knew they lived in a lesser age. Their kings grew old, their cities crumbled, their gods demanded constant attention. But they also knew that the cycle would continue. Just as the flood had come and gone, so too would future collapses and renewals. The King List, in its calm enumeration, is a map of that faith, the conviction that even after the greatest catastrophe, the world can start again. And so it did. After the deluge, humanity took its first steps into history. The clay tablets began to multiply, names became records, and memory hardened into writing. The gods watched from their temples as humans learned to measure time in years rather than eternities. The flood had drawn the boundary between myth and record, and from that boundary, civilization grew. From here, the King List turns toward the next great mystery. The figures who came after the flood yet still bore traces of the divine, the beings who bridged myth and monarchy. The Anunnaki, once rulers of heaven and earth, now retreated into legend, but their shadow remained over every throne. Humanity ruled the land, but the gods still ruled the story. When the world dried and the rivers carved their paths again, the people who rebuilt it didn't believe they were alone. The flood may have separated heaven and earth, but it hadn't severed them completely. In the silence that followed, the Sumerians still felt the presence of their old teachers, the gods who had once ruled directly, the beings they called the Anunnaki. Their names appeared everywhere, on temple walls, in hymns, in prayers whispered during planting and harvest. They weren't just gods in the abstract sense. They were remembered as administrators of creation, divine figures with specific duties, laws, and hierarchies. And although they no longer walked among humans, their influence shaped every aspect of life. The Anunnaki are some of the most misunderstood figures in ancient history. To the Sumerians, they weren't a single race or family, but a council of divine powers who governed the functions of the cosmos. Their name, roughly translated, means those of royal seed, or the princely offspring of Anu, the sky god. They were the children of Anu, the the highest god of the heavens, and Kai, the earth. Together they represented the link between celestial order and terrestrial life. The Sumerians saw them as the ultimate example of structure, each god responsible for a domain, each domain woven into the fabric of existence. In that sense, they weren't just deities, they were the architecture of the universe itself. After the flood, as the King List shifts from divine to mortal rule, the Anunnaki remain in the background, their names recurring in hymns and rituals. Their physical presence may have faded, but their authority continued through kingship. Every ruler in Sumer claimed legitimacy through them. To be king was not to be chosen by men, but to be sanctioned by the Anunnaki. That idea wasn't symbolic, it was law. The same way gravity holds the planets in place, divine favour held society together. Without it, nothing stood. In the Sumerian worldview, the gods didn't simply reign from afar, they delegated. They worked through intermediaries, priests, kings, scribes. Each temple was a miniature version of heaven, a branch office of the divine bureaucracy. The Anunnaki presided over it all, a celestial council that decided fates, maintained cosmic order, and ensured that the boundaries between chaos and civilization remained intact. To disobey the king wasn't just a political crime, it was a spiritual one, an act against the very structure of reality. It's strange, isn't it? How such an ancient idea still echoes in our world. The belief that authority descends from a higher realm, that legitimacy isn't merely human invention, has never really gone away. The Sumerians didn't invent that notion, but they were the first to record it clearly. The King List is proof. Its entire structure depends on that flow of kingship from heaven to earth. The flood didn't end divine rule, it decentralized it. The Anunnaki no longer governed directly, but they ruled through their chosen representatives. Humanity, newly mortal and self-aware, became their instrument. The myths describe the Anunnaki as numerous, sometimes numbering 50 or more, though the core group often includes 7 principal gods. These 7 appear again and again across Mesopotamian texts: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Utu, Nana, and Inanna. Each held dominion over a sphere of existence: heaven, air, water, earth, sun, moon, and love or war. Together they formed the framework of reality. It's telling that the number 7, sacred in so many later traditions, finds its earliest meaning here. The 7 Anunnaki sat in judgment, decreed destinies, and oversaw the fate of kings. When the King List claims that kingship descended from heaven, it implies that the Anunnaki sanctioned the succession. Every ruler's legitimacy was, in theory, decided in their divine assembly. But what did it mean for these gods to rule among men? The answer depends on how literally you take the Sumerian texts. To the ancient scribes, the boundary between myth and history didn't exist. They saw no contradiction in describing divine beings walking the earth, building cities, or granting knowledge. The temples of Sumer weren't just places of worship. They were believed to be residences, physical locations where the gods could descend, rest, and dine on offerings. Each ziggurat, each sanctuary was designed as a stairway between realms. Rituals weren't symbolic acts, they were negotiations, maintaining the balance that allowed heaven and earth to stay in contact. It's easy to imagine how those ideas might have evolved from memory. The oldest layers of Mesopotamian myth speak of a time when the gods and humans shared the same space. The flood marked the end of that age, but the Sumerians couldn't forget it. They continued to build cities as if to invite the gods back. The temples were recreations of the old world, miniature heavens rising from the dust. In those sacred spaces the Anunnaki were present again, not in flesh but in ritual. When the priests recited hymns to Enki or Inanna, they weren't praising absent deities, they were calling them down. The King List, though written in the language of chronology, carries the same impulse. It traces kingship as a relay of divine power, moving from city to city the way the sun moves across the sky. Each transfer represents both a political shift and a cosmic one. When Eridu fell and Kish rose, when Kish gave way to Uruk, it wasn't random. It was the will of the Anunnaki expressed through history. The cities themselves were participants in the divine drama, each holding kingship for a time before passing it on. That rhythm of succession mirrored the cosmic cycles: day and night, flood and drought, life and death. There's a profound sense of order in that worldview. Even chaos has a place. The flood, for instance, isn't rebellion against the gods, it's part of their design. The Anunnaki don't act out of malice but necessity. When the world becomes unbalanced, they restore equilibrium. Humanity's task, then, is to understand their decrees and adapt. It's not submission so much as cooperation, a covenant between the mortal and the divine. In that covenant, the king stands as mediator. His justice reflects cosmic justice. His failure invites disaster. That's why early Mesopotamian rulers took their religious duties so seriously. Every irrigation canal, every temple, every legal code was an attempt to align human society with divine geometry. When you read the hymns dedicated to the Anunnaki, you notice something subtle. They aren't described as distant, perfect beings. They argue, they judge, they deliberate. They experience conflict and reconciliation. Their power is immense, but it's also organized. There's always structure, always purpose. This is what makes them different from the chaotic forces of other ancient mythologies. The Sumerians weren't afraid of their gods. They depended on them as the foundation of logic itself. Even fear was a form of respect, not terror of punishment, but awe at complexity. As centuries passed, the figure of the Anunnaki evolved. In later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, they become a more defined pantheon, sometimes contrasted with another group, the Agigi, the younger gods who serve them. These distinctions show how deeply the Sumerians and their successors thought about hierarchy. The cosmos was a mirror of their society, tiered, organized, bound by duty. Kings served gods, priests served kings, and ordinary people served both. That structure may seem rigid, but it created stability. The flood had taught them that chaos could erase everything. Order was sacred because it was fragile. What's interesting is how the Anunnaki's reputation changes depending on perspective. In some myths, they are benefactors, teachers who give humanity the arts of civilization, writing, farming, mathematics. In others, they are stern judges, sending plagues or floods when balance fails. This duality is deliberate. The Sumerians didn't see their gods as purely good or evil. They were forces of nature, necessary, impartial, eternal. The task of humanity was to understand, appease, and align with them, not to worship blindly or rebel. The idea that the Anunnaki once walked among men has, of course, taken on new meanings in modern imagination. Some interpret them as metaphors for early dynastic rulers deified after death. Others, more speculative, see them as ancient visitors, extraterrestrial or otherwise, who brought knowledge from beyond. The truth may be simpler and, in a way, more profound. The Anunnaki were the Sumerians' way of explaining how intelligence, law, and technology entered the world. They weren't trying to mystify reality, they were trying to organize it. By attributing their advancements to divine guidance, they were expressing humility, the understanding that knowledge itself feels like a gift from beyond. It's worth remembering that the Sumerians were among the first to map the stars, measure time, and calculate the movements of planets. To them, the heavens were not abstract. They were a pattern to be deciphered. The Anunnaki were part of that pattern, the embodiment of the laws that governed both sky and earth. When a scribe wrote of Enlil commanding the winds or Inanna descending into the underworld, he wasn't describing fantasy. He was describing cosmic mechanics in human language. The myths were instruction manuals for reality, written in symbols the human mind could grasp. The King List fits perfectly into that system. It's not only a genealogy of rulers, but a timeline of divine energy. the transfer of kingship mirroring the movement of celestial bodies. Just as planets complete cycles, so too did kingship revolve among cities. The Anunnaki presided over these transitions. They were both the observers and the cause, ensuring that time didn't stagnate. The flood was one of their greatest interventions, but the process continued endlessly. Creation, destruction, renewal, each phase governed by divine decree, each decree reflected in the rule of men. When archaeologists uncovered temple tablets listing offerings to the gods, they noticed how meticulous the records were. Every ritual had its proper day, every god their share. The priests believed that imbalance in ritual could lead to imbalance in the cosmos. That's how deeply the idea of the Anunnaki penetrated daily life. The divine was not distant, it was procedural. The same mentality that organized their gods organized their cities, their trade, their law. The flood had turned them into managers of their own world, but they still looked upward for instructions. And perhaps that's what made the Sumerians so enduringly fascinating. They saw divinity not as chaos or caprice, but as structure. The Anunnaki weren't beings to fear, but principles to understand. In their mythology, even rebellion had purpose. When Inanna defied Enlil, or when Enki tricked other gods to save humanity, those acts weren't heresy. They were part of the cosmic dialogue. The gods debated because the world was complex. That complexity mirrored the human experience perfectly. The Sumerians didn't need perfection. They needed balance. When you read their texts today, the Anunnaki seem both alien and familiar. Alien because their world was so different. A flat land between rivers, ruled by priests and omens, drenched in ritual precision. Familiar because their questions were ours. Who made us? Why do we suffer? What gives authority its legitimacy? They answered with a system that connected every aspect of existence. Heaven was the origin, earth the reflection, and humanity the link. The Anunnaki stood in the middle, shaping both realms. It's easy to romanticize or exaggerate them, but perhaps the real mystery lies not in who they were, but in what they represented. They were the personification of law before law, the embodiment of order before science, the first articulation of cosmic governance. Their mythology wasn't primitive theology, it was philosophy in symbolic form. The Sumerians didn't just invent gods, they invented systems thinking. As time went on, later civilizations inherited their structure. The Akkadians adopted their pantheon. The Babylonians renamed the gods but kept their roles. Even the Hebrews, centuries later, retained echoes of their cosmology. A divine council, a heavenly hierarchy, a flood dividing the world. The Anunnaki faded into linguistic memory, but their blueprint endured. The concept of divine administration, of a cosmos governed by decree rather than chaos, spread across the ancient world. In the end, the Anunnaki among men were not a lost race or forgotten visitors. They were the first model of governance, the template for civilization itself. Through them, humanity learned to think hierarchically, to structure time and authority, to see the world as an ordered whole. Their legacy lives not in temples or myths, but in the way we still organize our societies, our laws, and even our stories. And yet, in the quiet of the ruins, their names still whisper through the dust. Enlil, the breath of the wind. Enki, the flowing water. Inanna, the star of morning and evening. Ninhursag, mother of the mountains. They are no longer gods of worship, but metaphors of continuity. Their temples have crumbled, but their influence remains embedded in language, in law, in the human habit of structure. The Anunnaki are still among us, not as beings of flesh, but as the architects of the idea that the universe can be understood, that even after chaos, there is order to be found. And as the King List moves forward, tracing the line of mortal rulers who carry that legacy, the story begins to shift once more, from divine inheritance to mathematical mystery, from the gods' decrees to the strange precision of numbers that governed their world. The Anunnaki may have withdrawn from the earth, but their code remained, written not in commandments, but in calculation. The Sumerians didn't see numbers the way we do. For them, numbers weren't just measurements or calculations. They were the structure of reality itself. Every field, every temple, every offering, every day of the calendar rested on numerical balance. Their gods didn't speak in commandments carved on stone. They spoke in patterns, ratios, cycles, and harmonies. The Sumerians learned early that if you could measure something, you could understand it, and if you could understand it, you could preserve it. That belief turned their civilization into a living equation, one in which time, divinity, and human order were all variables in the same eternal formula. When we read the King List and see those impossible reigns, 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years, it's tempting to dismiss them as exaggerations, but to the Sumerians they weren't absurd, they were sacred. Each number meant something precise within their mathematical system, a code that linked heaven and earth. The Sumerians were the first to use a sexagesimal system, base 60, instead of our modern base 10. That choice was not arbitrary. 60 was seen as the number of completeness, a divine constant, because it could be divided evenly by so many others. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It contained within it the balance of opposites, the harmony of variety. It was in a sense the numerical expression of the cosmos. That's why so much of their world was built around it. They divided a circle into 360 degrees, a year into 12 months, a day into 24 hours, an hour into 60 minutes. Even now, 5,000 years later, we still live inside their numerical logic. When you check the time, you're reading a Sumerian inheritance. Every second that ticks by on your clock carries a little of their cosmology. It's remarkable how quietly that influence survives. Invisible, constant, unquestioned. To understand how deeply numbers shape their worldview, imagine the daily life of a Sumerian scribe. He sits cross-legged on the floor, a small tablet of clay before him, a reed stylus in hand. Around him are baskets filled with other tablets, records of grain shipments, temple offerings, taxes, and wages. His task is to keep balance, not just in accounting, but in meaning. Every transaction, every measure of barley has to align with the order decreed by the gods. The tablet he writes on is both ledger and prayer. When he marks 60, he's not only recording quantity but invoking the number of perfection. When he writes 12, he's echoing the months of the moon, the cycle of renewal. To him, numbers are sacred geometry, the grammar of creation. It's easy to see why they would think that way. The natural world around them moved in patterns that seemed mathematical. The stars rose and fell in steady cycles. The rivers flooded at roughly predictable intervals. Even life itself followed rhythms: birth, growth, decay, renewal. To the Sumerians, those weren't coincidences. They were evidence of design. Numbers were the language of that design, and by learning it, humans could glimpse the thoughts of the gods. The King List, with its precise but otherworldly reigns, was not a record of years so much as a record of cosmic order. Each number symbolized a phase of balance between heaven and earth. Consider the first king, Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years. In base 60, that's 8 times 3,600, 8 sars. A sar, or 3600, was the fundamental divine unit of time. It represented a complete heavenly cycle, perhaps inspired by the long orbit of celestial bodies, or the great turning of the heavens. By assigning Alulim 8 sars, the Sumerians weren't claiming he lived for 28,800 literal years. They were saying he embodied 8 cycles of divine perfection. His reign represented the completion of cosmic order, a divine prototype for all kings to follow. Each successive king's reign follows the same logic, built on multiples of 60 or 3,600. arranged with careful symmetry. When you chart the reigns on a grid, patterns emerge, alternating long and short spans, mirroring ratios seen in celestial cycles. It's as if the King List is not just history but astronomy encoded in political form. The divine kings before the flood correspond to ages of cosmic alignment. The human kings after it correspond to eras of earthly correction. The flood itself is the reset point and zero in their grand equation. This obsession with numerical harmony extended far beyond mythology. The Sumerians applied it to architecture, agriculture, even law. Temple dimensions were based on proportional ratios meant to reflect celestial order. Canal systems were measured in units that followed the same mathematical rhythm. They didn't separate science from religion or economy from cosmology. Every act of measurement was sacred because it reaffirmed the structure of the world. To measure wrongly wasn't just an error, it was a sin, a crack in the cosmic design. You can see this mindset in the way they wrote numbers themselves. Instead of symbols for each digit, they used combinations of wedge marks to represent multiples of 10 and 60. The system was positional, meaning the same sign could represent different values depending on its placement, a concept that wouldn't appear again in Western mathematics until much later. To use such a system required abstraction, foresight, and consistency. It also required faith in order, the belief that logic could capture reality. For the Sumerians, that faith was not philosophical, it was spiritual. Even their myths about the gods reflect mathematical thinking. Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, is described as dividing the world into measured portions, assigning duties to other gods, and setting limits on chaos. His sacred number was 40, while Enlil's was 50, Anu's 60, Inanna's 15. Each god's number corresponded to a celestial coordinate, a place in the great numerical map of existence. The King List mirrors this structure. Each reign corresponds to a value, a divine proportion. The names of kings and the numbers of their reigns were not chosen randomly. They were aligned to fit the cosmic ledger. The King List, in this sense, is a spiritual spreadsheet, the first attempt to turn theology into data. When you think about how early this was, around 2100 BCE for the surviving copies, but based on older originals, it's astonishing. These people had no modern instruments, no computers, no telescopes, yet they saw the world as a system that could be expressed numerically. Their insight wasn't about precision so much as meaning. They used numbers to give structure to uncertainty. To live in a world of floods and droughts, of unpredictable gods and fragile crops, was to crave order. Numbers offered that. They turned chaos into pattern, and pattern into comfort. It's possible that this drive for numerical order is what made Mesopotamia the birthplace of both mathematics and bureaucracy. The same impulse that led a priest to calculate offerings for the temple led another to calculate the reigns of kings. Both acts came from the same desire, to anchor existence in something measurable. The flood had taught them that the world could vanish without warning. Numbers gave them a way to fight that impermanence. To count was to control. To record was to remember. You can see the emotional dimension of this in how they wrote about destiny. In Sumerian belief, destiny was not random. It was decreed in numbers by the gods. The phrase me referred to divine decrees, fundamental aspects of civilization like truth, justice, craftsmanship, kingship, and wisdom. These me were described as both laws and quantities, measurable forces that defined the order of things. When Enki distributed them among the gods and humans, he was assigning not just responsibilities but proportions, ensuring that every aspect of creation fit the grand equation. The King List can be seen as a reflection of that logic. Kingship itself was one of the me, handed down from heaven to maintain numerical and moral balance. In modern terms, it might sound abstract, but to the Sumerians, it was as tangible as brick and clay. When they built a temple, They measured its foundation according to sacred ratios. When they recorded reigns, they used numbers that fit divine patterns. They believed that by keeping the right proportions, they were sustaining the very fabric of reality. And perhaps, in their way, they were right. Their civilization lasted for thousands of years, surviving floods, invasions, and dynastic collapse. What held it together wasn't just military might or fertile soil, it was structure, the habit of order expressed through numbers. When archaeologists deciphered the King List in the early 20th century, they focused on the literal problem of those reigns. Could anyone really rule for 43,200 years? The answer, of course, was no, at least not in human terms. But that question misses the point. The Sumerians weren't trying to describe biological lifespans. They were describing cycles of cosmic legitimacy. Each massive number marks an age in which divine harmony held firm. The flood interrupts the pattern, the reset, and afterward, reigns shorten to reflect the human condition. What changes isn't their belief in order, but their understanding of their place within it. The numbers shrink because humanity has taken the throne. Still, those enormous figures had power. Even today, they provoke speculation. Why so specific? Why such consistency across copies of the King List? Some modern researchers have noticed that the total span of pre-flood kingship, 241 on 200 years, divides neatly into 3600s, producing symbolic cycles. Others note parallels to astronomical periods, like the precession of equinoxes or the long orbits of planets. It's impossible to know whether the Sumerians intended such correlations consciously, but their fascination with celestial order suggests it's not unthinkable. The heavens were their calendar, their clock, their divine record. It makes sense that their history would mirror the stars. That alignment between sky and earth defined everything in Sumer. Festivals were timed to lunar phases. Agricultural rituals matched seasonal constellations. Even the arrangement of cities seemed to follow patterns linked to celestial bodies. To the Sumerians, heaven wasn't a distant place. It was a map. The Anunnaki, as celestial administrators, governed both the stars above and the kings below. Their decrees were written in the movement of the planets, and their law was expressed in the geometry of the heavens. The King List is, in that sense, both myth and almanac, a timeline of how divine mathematics became human governance. If you imagine a scribe reading the King List aloud in a temple courtyard, it would have sounded less like history and more like liturgy. Each name, each number, each city was part of a pattern that reinforced cosmic order. Reciting it wasn't just remembering the past, it was reaffirming the structure of the universe. To speak those numbers was to participate in creation again. Even now, when we read them, we feel a trace of that power. Numbers, when given meaning, become eternal. It's remarkable how something so abstract can feel so alive. Those long reigns, those precise totals, still carry an aura of mystery. Not because they're unbelievable, but because they hint at a way of seeing the world we've mostly forgotten. We treat numbers as tools. The Sumerians treated them as truths. To them, counting was not mechanical. It was devotional. Each number was a step closer to understanding the divine symmetry that governed everything. Perhaps that's why their civilization endured so long after their kings fell. Even when dynasties ended, the numbers remained. The sexagesimal system outlived empires. The geometry of their temples outlasted their gods. Their mathematics became the invisible skeleton of every civilization that followed. Every time we look at a clock, every time we divide a circle, every time we balance a ledger, we're speaking the same language they invented to write eternity. The King List, viewed this way, is less a historical document than a mathematical hymn. It doesn't tell us who the kings were. It tells us what kingship meant. It shows how the Sumerians turned divine philosophy into arithmetic, how they gave immortality a numerical form. The flood may have erased cities, but it couldn't erase the pattern. The gods withdrew from the earth, but their logic remained, written in the very structure of time. And as that logic continued to unfold, it shaped not just religion or architecture, but thought itself. The Sumerians had discovered that abstraction could preserve meaning, that numbers could hold eternity in place when words and walls could not. And from that realization came the next stage of their story, the one where divine mathematics became political philosophy, and where kings learned to wield the power of heaven through the order of earth. Because after the numbers were written, after the cycles were set, a question remained. Who would interpret them? Who would keep the balance when numbers alone weren't enough? The answer lay in the cities that followed, in the rulers who inherited the sacred arithmetic of time and turned it into the geometry of power. If the Sumerian King List was a record of reigns, it was also a map. Not a map drawn on land or parchment, but one traced through time. Each city, each dynasty, each number of years formed coordinates in a grand design. The Sumerians weren't just documenting who ruled, they were charting how divine authority moved through the world. They saw history as a geography of power, with kingship migrating from one city to another, the way the sun crossed the sky. And because kingship itself descended from heaven, every transfer of rule mirrored the movement of celestial order. The King List was the closest thing the ancient world had to a time map, one that didn't show roads or borders, but the invisible current of legitimacy flowing from heaven to earth. It begins, as all their stories do, in Eridu, the first city where Alulim was granted rule. After the flood, kingship descended again, this time to Kish. Then it moved to Uruk, to Ur, to Awan, to Hamasi, to Mari, to Akshak, to Akkad, to Isin. Each name isn't just a political centre but a node in a cosmic network. The movement isn't random. It's rhythmic, patterned, deliberate. It traces the same principle found everywhere in their world, that everything must circulate, that nothing divine can remain fixed in one place. When the Sumerians said that kingship passed to Kish, they didn't just mean that a new dynasty conquered the old one. They meant that heaven had shifted its focus. To the modern mind, this seems strange. We think of history as cause and effect, one event leading to another through human ambition and accident. But for the Sumerians, history was the visible trace of divine mathematics. The rise and fall of cities weren't political accidents. They were the breath of gods moving through the world. Each city's prosperity depended not only on irrigation or trade, but on whether it still held the favour of the Anunnaki. The King List wasn't describing history, it was prescribing meaning. To read it was to understand why things happened, not how. What's fascinating is how that logic shaped their politics. Kingship was both an office and a sacrament. A ruler's duty wasn't merely to govern, but to embody balance. When kingship moved, it wasn't just power changing hands, it was the cosmic centre relocating. The new king had to realign the city to divine order, rebuild temples, establish justice, correct measures. Everything physical mirrored something cosmic. A city at peace was one in which heaven and earth were synchronized. A city at war was one that had fallen out of harmony. The King List, in its dry enumeration, hides that entire philosophy. Archaeology gives glimpses of how this worked. Each major city-state had its own patron deity and temple complex, Enki in Eridu, Enlil in Nippur, Inanna in Uruk, Nanna in Ur, Anu in Kish. When kingship passed from one city to another, it often coincided with shifts in religious prominence. Temples were rebuilt, gods renamed or merged, rituals standardized. It was as if each transfer of kingship required the rewriting of cosmic geography. The King List, by listing those transfers in order, offers not just chronology, but theology in motion. This moving kingship had real consequences. It legitimized conquest, stabilized succession, and unified a fragmented landscape. In a world of independent city-states often at war, the King List told them they were part of one divine cycle. No city ruled forever, but every city had its turn. That belief may have prevented total collapse more than once. Even when one city fell, its people could accept it as part of the natural order. Power wasn't stolen, it was rotated. In a way, the King List was an early attempt to rationalise the chaos of politics through the logic of heaven. The more you look at it, the more the text reads like a political document disguised as myth. It probably wasn't written by neutral scribes, but by scholars serving one of the later dynasties, most likely an Izin or Larsa, around the early 2nd millennium BCE. These scribes inherited thousands of years of fragmented records and oral histories. Their task wasn't just to preserve the past, but to make sense of it, to impose order on centuries of rivalry. By arranging dynasties in a single line, they created continuity where there had been division. The King List told every city, even defeated ones, that they were part of the same divine story. It was a work of reconciliation, as much theology as propaganda. That's the genius of it. The King List didn't erase chaos, it absorbed it. Wars, floods, and dynastic collapses became part of the pattern. Every disruption was followed by restoration. Every gap in the record was filled with a city where kingship descended again. It's easy to imagine how this idea would comfort a society living with constant instability. The world might crumble, but the cycle would continue. Someone, somewhere, would receive kingship anew. The divine ledger always balanced in the end. Even its language reinforces that sense of inevitability. The phrasing repeats like a chant. Then Kish fell. Kingship was taken to Uruk. Uruk fell. Kingship was taken to The rhythm creates a sense of movement, like a pendulum swinging between heaven and earth. There's no moral judgment in those lines. No city is blamed for losing kingship. No ruler is praised for keeping it. The flow is impersonal, mechanical, almost mathematical. That neutrality is deliberate. It removes history from human fault and places it in divine hands. The King List wasn't about heroes or villains, it was about balance. You can see the same logic in their art and architecture. Ziggurats, those towering temple pyramids, were built in layers, each level smaller than the one below, reaching upward in a precise gradient. The design was geometric, symmetrical, and cosmological all at once. Each brick represented stability, each stair the connection between worlds. The King List is built the same way, with each dynasty stacked atop the last, forming a stairway through time. The Sumerians built their cities and their histories from the same blueprint, ordered ascent toward the divine. This way of thinking also explains their obsession with record keeping. To them, writing wasn't just communication, it was control. A written word could fix meaning the way a wall fixed space. Lists in particular had power. By listing kings, gods, or decrees, scribes weren't merely describing reality, they were organising it. The King List, therefore, was an act of creation in itself. To write the sequence of reigns was to define time, to lock chaos into structure. The clay tablets that carried those names weren't passive archives, they were instruments of stability. Every wedge pressed into clay was a statement that order existed and that it could be recorded. That's why the King List feels both factual and ritualistic. It belongs to both history and religion. When the scribe wrote, "After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven to Kish," he wasn't just noting succession, he was affirming faith. Each repetition of that descent was a prayer that the gods still governed, that the world still had meaning. It's no accident that the word for king in Sumerian, Lugal, means great man, but also representative. The king wasn't divine himself, but he embodied divine order on earth. The King List gave him context, proof that his authority was part of a chain stretching back to the beginning of time. For modern historians, the King List is invaluable because it bridges myth and archaeology. Some of its later kings, like Mebrajisi of Kish or Mesanapeda of Ur, have been found in inscriptions and tombs. That confirmation turns the text into something unique, a document that starts with divine immortals and ends with verifiable human rulers. It's a gradient from myth to history, showing how the Sumerians themselves transitioned from storytelling to record keeping. But to them that distinction didn't exist. To write about divine kings and mortal kings in the same list wasn't inconsistency. It was continuity. The divine and the human were part of the same unfolding narrative. And that's where the idea of a map becomes literal again. The king list isn't arranged geographically, but if you trace the sequence of cities, you can see a movement across Mesopotamia, from south to north, from the marshlands of Eridu to the uplands of Kish and back again. It's as if kingship followed the path of the rivers themselves, drifting along the Tigris and Euphrates like silt carried downstream. That correspondence may not have been intentional, but it reflects how the Sumerians saw their world. A landscape shaped by divine currents. Water, time, and power all flowed the same way, cyclically, continuously, never still. Even their word for time had spatial connotations. It didn't mean linear progression, but sequence, placement, rhythm. The past wasn't behind them. It was beneath them, layered like the ruins of cities. Each generation built on the one before, not metaphorically, but literally. When archaeologists dig through a tell, a mound made of millennia of human habitation, they're moving through that same conception of time. The king list, in clay form, is its textual equivalent, a stratified landscape of memory. One could argue that the king list is the first philosophy of history ever written. It doesn't just record what happened, it explains why history happens at all. It suggests that time isn't chaos or fate, but a managed process. The gods decree, the kings execute, the scribes record. The pattern repeats indefinitely. Even when empires crumble, the process continues. The flood was proof of that. The ultimate disruption followed by renewal. The king list assures its readers that every fall contains its own restoration. It's the theological version of resilience. That idea would echo for millennia. Later Mesopotamian empires, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, all adopted the same cyclical worldview. Each saw itself not as a new creation, but as the latest turn in an eternal pattern. Even their kings' titles reflect it. King of the Four Quarters, Shepherd of the People, Chosen of the Gods. The legitimacy of each ruler depended on how well they fit into the inherited rhythm. The king list gave them that rhythm. It was both a calendar and a constitution. It's striking how the Sumerians' need for order still defines us. We no longer see kingship as divine, but we still map power through time. We write chronologies, build timelines, create succession charts. Our histories too are lists, presidents, monarchs, dynasties, leaders. We may not call it divine descent, but we still trace legitimacy through continuity. The king list's logic, that authority is justified by belonging to a sequence, still governs how we think about institutions. The difference is that we attribute the pattern to human reason rather than the will of gods. But the shape of that pattern remains the same. In a sense, the Sumerians discovered something that all civilizations eventually rediscover, that history itself can be used as a tool of power. To control the narrative of the past is to control belief in the present. Whoever compiles the list defines legitimacy. The king list's creators understood that perfectly. By choosing which kings to include, which cities to honour, and which to omit, they shaped collective memory. They didn't need armies to conquer minds. They needed chronology. The list became law. And yet, for all its political function, there's still something deeply human about it. Beneath the theology and structure, you can sense a longing for coherence. The Sumerians were surrounded by unpredictability. Floods, droughts, invasions, disease. Writing order into time was their way of pushing back against uncertainty. The king list isn't just a record of rulers, it's a declaration of faith in meaning itself. It tells us that even when the world collapses, the pattern endures. That's why it survived on clay for 5,000 years. The tablets didn't just record history, they embodied its resilience. So when you look at the king list today, Try to see it not as a primitive chronology, but as a map of how humans first learned to connect the divine and the political, the eternal and the immediate. It's a chart of how we made sense of time by giving it shape, how we turned memory into geometry. The Sumerians didn't just invent kingship, they invented the structure that made kingship make sense, and as that structure solidified, it led to something new, a meeting point between past and present, between myth and evidence. Because eventually the world they described in numbers and patterns was uncovered by men with shovels, notebooks, and brushes. The same clay that once held divine decrees began to speak again, this time to archaeologists and scholars who were trying to decode its meaning. The story of kingship, the story of time itself, would be rediscovered piece by piece from the dust of forgotten cities. When the first archaeologists arrived in Mesopotamia, they didn't know they were walking on libraries. The mounds that dotted the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates looked like nothing more than the scars of wind and time, shapeless heaps of dirt rising from flat horizons. To local villagers, they were just part of the landscape, ancient and unremarkable. But beneath those mounds lay something that would change how humanity saw itself. Inside them were fragments of our oldest recorded memories, stories, decrees, and lists pressed into clay before pyramids rose or alphabets existed. Among them, hidden for thousands of years, was the Sumerian King List, a tablet that would whisper of rulers who lived for tens of thousands of years and of a flood that wiped the slate of history clean. The rediscovery began in the 19th century in an era obsessed with the past. Europe was in the middle of its great archaeological awakening. Egypt's monuments had already stunned explorers, and the ruins of Greece and Rome had been catalogued and romanticised. But Mesopotamia remained a mystery, a land of biblical echoes, known more from scripture than from science. Adventurers and diplomats began digging almost by accident, following rumours of buried cities. Their methods were crude, but their discoveries were extraordinary. Broken bricks, strange inscriptions, pieces of sculpture, and most curiously small clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped impressions no one could read. Those marks would turn out to be cuneiform, the first true writing system humanity ever created. It took decades to decipher, a process that mixed scholarship with obsession. The key came from a trilingual inscription known as the Behistun inscription, carved high into a cliff in what is now Iran. It contained the same text written in 3 ancient languages, one of them Old Persian and another Babylonian. By comparing them, scholars cracked the code. Suddenly, those mute clay tablets began to speak. And what they said wasn't mythic in tone. It was administrative, practical, precise. Lists of grain rations, trade accounts, royal decrees, hymns, contracts, prayers, civilization itself, documented in clay. Among those early finds were fragments of texts that mentioned kings and cities long forgotten. Some of them matched names from the Bible, others had no parallel anywhere. As more tablets surfaced, a pattern began to emerge, recurring lists of rulers stretching back far before recorded history. The pieces were scattered across museums and excavation sites, incomplete and inconsistent. It would take years before anyone realised that these fragments all belonged to one ancient document, the King List. The man who finally assembled its first coherent version was Hermann Hilprecht, a German-American Assyriologist working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He and his colleagues were studying tablets unearthed from the ancient city of Nippur, one of Mesopotamia's oldest religious centres. Nippur was sacred to Enlil, the god of air and authority, the same deity who presided over kingship itself. It was fitting that the tablet linking heaven's rule to human history should resurface there. When Hilprecht began to translate its lines, he realised what he was holding, a list of kings stretching from the dawn of time to the dynasties of his own era, some with reigns that defied reason. The discovery caused both excitement and confusion. The King List seemed to blur the line between myth and record. Some of its names were clearly legendary, kings ruling for 43,200 years or more. Others, like Enmebaragesi of Kish, were known from independent inscriptions that proved they were real historical figures. That overlap challenged everything scholars thought they knew about ancient history. The text wasn't a myth, but it wasn't a normal chronicle either. It was something in between, a bridge between divine memory and human record-keeping. To understand how startling that was, imagine discovering a single document that links the reigns of Zeus and Alexander the Great as part of one unbroken lineage. That's what the King List represented. It forced scholars to confront the possibility that the earliest civilizations didn't distinguish between mythic and historical truth. To them, divine and mortal history were the same story, measured in different scales. But the King List's numbers presented a puzzle that remains unsolved even now. Why such enormous reigns? Why such precision? The scribes who wrote them weren't careless. They were meticulous in everything else. They could calculate lunar months, land divisions and trade weights with astonishing accuracy. So why would they record absurdities? Hilprecht and others debated endlessly. Some thought it was symbolic, that the vast numbers represented astronomical cycles or divine eras. Others suspected they were the result of corrupted copies, mistakes multiplied over centuries. But the consistency of the figures across versions argued against that. The mystery deepened. As more versions of the King List were found, the pattern became clearer. Copies appeared in Lhasa, Uruk, and even in later Babylonian archives. Though details varied, the structure remained the same. The divine kings before the flood itself, the human kings after. The order of cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, stayed constant. That stability over millennia suggested something more than local record-keeping. It implied a shared narrative across Sumerian culture, a collective memory of beginnings. The King List wasn't just a historical text, it was a national myth, a framework of identity. When scholars began comparing it to other ancient traditions, the parallels were hard to ignore. The flood described in the King List echoed the story of Noah, though the Sumerian version was far older. The impossibly long lives of the pre-flood kings matched the ages of the biblical patriarchs, from Adam to Methuselah. Even the total years of reigns before the flood, 241 and 200, invited comparison with the great ages described in other mythologies. It was as if all these later traditions were faint reflections of the same source, refracted through different cultures and languages. For early 20th century scholars raised in biblical archaeology, this was electrifying. It suggested that the oldest parts of Genesis might have roots in Sumerian memory. Still, the King List didn't fit comfortably into theology. Its tone was bureaucratic, not moral. It wasn't about sin or salvation. It was about sequence. It recorded what happened, not why. That difference set the Sumerian worldview apart from later religious traditions. Their gods weren't moral arbiters, but administrators of balance. Their history wasn't a march toward redemption, but a rotation of order. The King List's calm neutrality, its refusal to judge, baffled readers accustomed to epic drama. Yet that restraint was what made it so powerful. It felt ancient not because it was old, but because it was impersonal, written in the voice of time itself. In the early decades of the 20th century, archaeologists continued to dig deeper. In 1922, a version of the King List was found in the ruins of Lhasa, inscribed in the Old Babylonian period. Other fragments turned up in Ashur and Susa. Each new piece helped fill gaps in the sequence, but also raised new questions. Some kings appeared in different orders, some cities were missing. The flood remained constant, always in the same place, dividing eternity from time. By the 1930s, the standard version had been established, a text that could now be read from beginning to end. It was then that its deeper implications began to unfold. One of the scholars most captivated by it was Samuel Noah Kramer. a Ukrainian-born Assyriologist who had spent his life translating Sumerian literature. Kramer saw in the King List not just chronology, but psychology, the first human attempt to understand time as something that could be organised. He called it the earliest philosophy of history. The Sumerians, he wrote, were the first to grasp that civilization wasn't random, that there was a pattern in the succession of rulers and cities. They invented history by giving it a framework. In that sense, the King List wasn't primitive at all. It was the beginning of historical thought. As excavation continued through the 20th century, the King List's context grew clearer. Tablets describing temple offerings, city charters, and flood myths filled in its background. The world it described, the early dynastic period, was no longer a legend but a real archaeological horizon, visible in pottery, architecture, and burial sites. Cities once thought mythical were found in the earth, their walls and ziggurats emerging from the dust. Eridu, Uruk, Kish, all real, all layered with centuries of habitation. The flood layer that separates them around 2900 BCE gave physical proof to the text's turning point. It didn't matter whether the flood was universal or local. What mattered was that it happened, and the Sumerians remembered it. But even as archaeology confirmed the physical world of the King List, it couldn't explain its metaphysical one. Why did the Sumerians feel the need to arrange their past this way? Why the obsession with sequence, with continuity, with divine descent? Some scholars saw it as political propaganda, a way for later dynasties to claim legitimacy by linking themselves to the dawn of time. Others thought it was ritual, a recitation performed to reaffirm cosmic balance. Both interpretations may be true. The King List worked because it blended belief and practicality. It satisfied the scholar and the priest, the historian and the worshipper. It was fact written in mythic form. In time, the King List would leave the realm of archaeology and enter popular imagination. Its mention of kings ruling for hundreds of thousands of years caught the attention of writers outside academia. By the mid-20th century, it became a cornerstone of alternative theories about ancient history. Some saw in it evidence of advanced prehistoric civilizations or even extraterrestrial intervention. The names of the Anunnaki, once administrative gods in the Sumerian pantheon, were reinterpreted as visitors from the stars. To serious scholars, these claims were frustrating. But they also revealed something important, the enduring power of the text to provoke wonder. Even stripped of context, the King List still made people question the limits of history. For those who study it seriously, though, the mystery remains grounded in human thought. The King List is a monument to the human need for order. The Sumerians lived in a world of chaos, floods, invasions, famines, and yet they believed in structure. They believed that time could be measured, that meaning could be organised. They pressed that faith into clay and left it buried for millennia. When we read it today, we're not just studying their history, we're continuing their act of remembrance. Every translation, every interpretation is another hand on the same line of continuity. You can almost picture the first modern scholar to hold one of those tablets. The clay is heavy but small enough to fit in a palm. The wedge marks are precise, their edges still sharp despite the centuries. Under lamplight, the characters look like the imprint of logic itself. That scholar, whoever he was, probably felt what so many after him have described. The sense of touching a living thought, a mind that reached across 5,000 years. The Sumerians might have vanished, but their reasoning hadn't. The tablet was still doing its job, recording, explaining, enduring. What makes the King List extraordinary is not just its age or its content, but its persistence. Dozens of copies have survived, some written centuries apart, yet all preserving the same sequence of cities and kings. That continuity means that for over 1,000 years, Sumerians and their successors kept copying the text, updating it, expanding it. It wasn't a relic, it was alive. Each generation added its own rulers to the divine chain, extending eternity one reign at a time. The fact that we have multiple versions isn't a flaw, it's proof of vitality. History for them was a living document. By the time archaeologists pieced it together, the King List had already outlived empires, languages, and religions. It had survived the flood, the Akkadian conquest, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. It had crossed from clay to paper, from cuneiform to alphabet. When Hilprecht or Kramer read those words, they were continuing the same act the Sumerian scribes began, giving time a shape, giving chaos a sequence. Even now its meaning isn't fully settled. Some scholars focus on its mythological symbolism, others on its political context. Some see it as a template for all later chronologies, a prototype for the very idea of history. Whatever it is, it stands alone. There's nothing else like it in the ancient world, a text that starts in eternity and ends in reality, that treats the impossible with the same precision as the verifiable. The King List refuses to choose between myth and history because to the people who wrote it, there was no division. And that's what makes its rediscovery so profound. It didn't just teach us about the Sumerians, it reminded us of something about ourselves, that our need to record, to order, to remember, is ancient and instinctive. The scholars who dug it up weren't just excavating ruins, they were uncovering the blueprint of thought. Every ruler, every date, every line in that list is a testament to humanity's refusal to let the past dissolve. The flood may have wiped the world clean, but the clay remembered. And as the archaeologists brushed dust from those tablets and carried them into museums, they didn't realize they were continuing a ritual. The act of discovery became another link in the chain. The King List wasn't finished when it was buried. It's still being written every time we study it, every time we interpret it, every time we try to understand what the Sumerians were really saying when they described time as something that could descend from heaven. The scholars who dug up forever didn't just find artifacts. They found a mirror, one that reflects how much of our modern sense of order, time, and power began there, in the soft clay of forgotten cities. And as their discoveries spread through academia and beyond, the King List moved once again, passing from temple to museum, from clay to paper, from myth to modernity. Its reign, in a way, never ended. And while those early archaeologists were busy tracing its lineage, comparing its lines and debating its meaning, they might not have realized that they were about to uncover something even more complex. The space between gods and men, the strange territory where belief, politics, and history overlap. The King List would not just be a record of kings. It would become a map of how the divine withdrew and how humanity tried to fill the silence that followed. When the Sumerian King List reaches its later lines, something subtle happens. The divine begins to fade. The names that once carried the weight of eternity now sound like men, rulers, conquerors, city builders. Their reigns shorten, their deeds become more specific, their lives more tangible. The gods have stepped back, but they haven't vanished entirely. They remain in the margins, woven into the texture of every decision, every victory, every temple built in their honour. What emerges in these later records is a world suspended between two orders, divine oversight and human ambition. It's the in-between space where religion and politics become indistinguishable, and where history, for the first time, begins to define itself as something separate from myth. That transition didn't happen suddenly. It was gradual, like the tide pulling away from the shore. After the flood, kingship had descended from heaven again, but the nature of that kingship was different. The rulers were mortal, their reigns finite, their deaths recorded. Yet the legitimacy of their power still came from the same source. To rule was to hold a piece of the divine pattern, to administer heaven's logic on earth. Every city that received kingship became, for a time, the axis of the universe. Its ruler stood halfway between human and God, not immortal, but not entirely ordinary either. That idea would echo through every civilization that followed. from pharaohs to emperors to divine right monarchs. The Sumerians invented the liminal ruler, a man of clay wearing a crown of starlight. In the King List, that idea is embedded in the way history is written. The earlier sections read like myth, sweeping spans of time, enormous numbers, almost no detail. But as the text moves forward, the focus narrows. We begin to see wars, dynasties, conquests. The reigns are counted not in tens of thousands of years, but in hundreds, then dozens. The gods retreat to the temples, and humans take the stage. It's as if the camera of history has zoomed in. What was once cosmic becomes local, personal, political. The Sumerians had entered the era of evidence. That shift, from divine narration to human record, is one of the most profound moments in the history of civilization. It marks the birth of history as a concept. Before the Sumerians, time existed in stories, in cycles of creation and destruction told by priests and elders. After them, time became something that could be documented, numbered, and reviewed. The King List is the first known attempt to bridge those two modes of thought, to take a mythic worldview and express it as a sequence of events. In doing so, it created a paradox, a world still governed by gods but observed by men. The Sumerians didn't experience that paradox as conflict. To them, divine and human reality were layers of the same structure. The gods set the framework, humanity enacted it. When a king succeeded another, it wasn't merely inheritance, it was destiny unfolding according to divine order. The gods had written the script, the kings performed it. The King List, therefore, wasn't a neutral record of events. It was a document of obedience, a confirmation that humanity was still following heaven's design. But within that obedience, something new was stirring. As kingship became more human, kings themselves began to develop identities beyond their divine sanction. The later rulers of Kish, Uruk and Ur, left inscriptions that spoke in the first person. I built, I conquered, I restored. These were not just administrative notes, they were assertions of individuality. A divine king had no need to speak, his power was assumed. A human one needed to justify it. That subtle change in voice marks the birth of authorship, the awareness of self as something distinct from the cosmic order. The Sumerians may not have intended it, but in turning their gods into administrators and their kings into men, they opened the door to human agency. And yet, they never abandoned their belief in divine oversight. Every royal inscription begins with the same invocation, by the command of Enlil, or favoured by Inanna, or chosen by Nanna. The king's accomplishments were never credited solely to his will. Success was proof of divine favour, failure, evidence of its withdrawal. The relationship between gods and men was transactional, but it was also symbiotic. The gods needed worship, offerings, temples, tangible signs of devotion. The kings needed divine endorsement to rule. Each sustained the other. In that exchange, civilization found stability. It's fascinating how this model of divine partnership endured, even as Sumer fragmented into rival city-states, each with its own patron deity. The logic of the King List held firm. Kingship always came from heaven, even if the city that held it changed. The divine framework survived political chaos. In fact, it gave meaning to chaos. When a city fell, it wasn't a random defeat. It was part of the cycle. The gods had simply chosen a new centre. That belief prevented despair. It allowed the Sumerians to interpret loss as transformation rather than annihilation. Still, beneath that cosmic reassurance, something more pragmatic was happening. The Sumerians were inventing history not just as faith, but as management. Their gods were rulers, but they were also bureaucrats. Heaven itself was imagined as an organised institution, a council, a system of decrees and records. The King List mirrors that structure. Each entry is formulaic: name, city, length of reign. No emotion, no commentary. It reads like a royal archive. The divine order had been converted into data. By writing it down, the Sumerians turned theology into administration. The boundary between godly will and civic duty vanished. The temple and the palace became the same institution. One governed the spirit, the other the body, both under the same set of laws. That merging of religion and record created something extraordinary: continuity. In a world where cities could be destroyed overnight by floods or invasion, written history became the only thing that endured. The King List was a technology of memory, one that outlasted its creators. By inscribing divine order into clay, the Sumerians ensured that even if the gods withdrew again, their system of meaning would survive. It's telling that when later civilizations inherited Sumerian culture, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, they kept the same logic. They changed the names of gods, but not the structure of power. Kingship still descended from heaven. Every ruler still saw himself as the chosen custodian of divine order. The Sumerians had set the template, and it proved impossible to erase. There's something quietly revolutionary in that. By institutionalizing the divine, they made belief permanent. Gods could change, rituals could evolve, but the mechanism, the system that connected heaven to earth, remained constant. The King List was not just a list of rulers. It was a diagram of how power should function forever. It was both scripture and constitution. The genius of the Sumerians was that they didn't separate those categories. To them, sacred and secular were the same current flowing through different channels. Modern historians sometimes struggle to understand that unity because our world is built on separation. We divide church and state, science and faith, fact and myth. The Sumerians didn't. To them, those divisions would have seemed absurd. Their gods were real, because their effects were real. The sun rose, the rivers flooded, the crops grew, all measurable, all divine. Their kings were legitimate because they built cities that lasted, laws that worked, temples that endured. In that sense, the line between God and man was not about power, but about permanence. The gods were eternal, kings were temporary. But for the duration of their reign, they share the same responsibility: to keep the world in order. That sense of shared duty is what makes the King List so strangely moving. It's not a story of conquest or empire, it's a story of stewardship. Every king inherits the same cosmic burden: maintain balance, sustain life, preserve continuity. The flood had shown them what happened when that balance failed. The King List was their collective insurance against chaos, a written reminder that the world depended on order being passed down without interruption. In that sense, it's not a record of glory but of obligation. And yet, within that obligation, the Sumerians began to express doubt. Their later literature reveals an emerging tension between divine justice and human suffering. Texts like the Lament for Ur describe gods abandoning cities, allowing them to fall to ruin despite their piety. The writers of those laments don't reject the gods. They question their silence. For the first time, humanity begins to see itself as separate enough to ask why. The flood had established the idea of divine reset. Now the Sumerians wondered about divine absence. The King List doesn't address that question directly, but its existence is a kind of answer. If kingship always descends again, then divine silence is temporary. History itself becomes proof of faith. That tension between belief and observation is what makes the Sumerians feel so modern. They lived in a world that demanded both devotion and documentation. Their priests prayed, their scribes measured, their kings built temples to honour the gods and canals to feed the people. Religion wasn't abstract, it was practical. To serve the gods was to manage the land efficiently, to maintain justice, to keep records accurate. Divine order was visible in working irrigation, stable trade, fair laws. The Sumerians didn't separate ethics from engineering. Both were forms of worship. The King List reflects that pragmatic spirituality perfectly. Its calm enumeration of rulers isn't indifference, it's discipline. By treating divine and human reigns with the same tone, the Sumerians were saying that both obeyed the same law. The gods may have withdrawn, but their system endured. Every number, every line, every repetition was a reaffirmation of that. The list itself became sacred. Even copying it was an act of devotion. That practice of recording divine order in human terms would eventually define civilization itself. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Greece to Rome, every empire that followed adopted some version of the same principle. The ruler as mediator between heaven and earth, his legitimacy guaranteed by cosmic order, his reign preserved through record. The Sumerians had found a way to anchor faith in evidence. They had made belief empirical. And that's where they exist, between gods and history. Their world was not yet secular, but no longer purely mythic. It was a bridge world, one that treated stories as records and records as stories. To read the King List is to step into that space, to see how the divine was transformed from a presence into a principle. The gods didn't disappear. They became laws, systems, numbers. They became the grammar of reality. Humanity, in turn, became the storyteller, the archivist, the keeper of divine syntax. When later cultures rediscovered the Sumerians, that in-between quality was what fascinated them most. The Greeks inherited their astronomy. The Hebrews inherited their flood. The Babylonians inherited their mathematics and their myths of divine order. But what no one could quite replicate was that balance, the ability to treat gods as administrators and men as instruments without losing reverence for either. The Sumerians lived in equilibrium with mystery. They didn't need to prove the divine or deny it. They simply recorded its work and kept the tablets safe. It's strange to think that this balance, born in mud-brick cities thousands of years ago, still shapes how we write history today. Our timelines, our records, our calendars, all of them descend from that same impulse to give the infinite a structure. We may not invoke Enlil or Inanna, but we still trust in order, still build systems to make sense of chaos. The Sumerians taught us that faith and evidence don't have to oppose each other. They can coexist, as long as both are written clearly. In that way, the King List remains one of humanity's most extraordinary achievements. It captures the moment when memory became measurable, when myth was translated into history without being diminished. The divine didn't die, it transformed. It moved from the heavens into the logic of the text, from miracles into mathematics, from speech into symbols pressed into clay. And there it stayed, waiting for others to find it, read it, and understand that between gods and history there has always been writing, the human attempt to make eternity legible. The Sumerians didn't invent time, but they invented the habit of keeping it. They didn't conquer eternity, but they learned how to record its passing. Their gods may have withdrawn into the invisible, but their memory survived through men who wrote with care, who understood that to remember is to honour and to list is to preserve. Between gods and history stands the scribe, stylus in hand, pressing eternity into clay before the flood returns. And as the last of those scribes looked up from his tablet, seeing his city fading, his temples crumbling, and the horizon darkening again, he might have felt the same quiet faith that his ancestors felt after the deluge, that kingship would descend again, that memory would survive, that the clay would endure even if the gods did not speak. And through that endurance the story would continue, because after all the divine was never gone. It had simply changed form. And now, the next question to emerge from that silence would not come from heaven, but from men who looked back at those names, those impossible numbers, and asked what they truly meant. By the time modern readers first encountered the word Anunnaki, it had already changed meaning more than once. To the Sumerians, they were the divine assembly, the administrators of heaven and earth, the cosmic bureaucracy that maintained the balance of creation. To the Akkadians and Babylonians who inherited their myths, they became a pantheon, a council of elder gods who ruled over fate. But in the modern age, the Anunnaki would undergo another transformation. They would move from myth to metaphor, from theology to theory. What began as the oldest expression of divine order became for many a mystery that stretched far beyond Mesopotamia, a puzzle inviting questions that traditional history wasn't equipped to answer. It started innocently enough, with scholars trying to interpret mythological language. Early translations of Sumerian texts in the 19th and early 20th centuries introduced Western readers to a world unlike anything described in the Bible or classical mythology. The gods of Sumer weren't distant creators, they were practical beings. They built cities, assigned duties, made laws, argued, punished, forgave. Their interactions with humanity were described with the same administrative precision the Sumerians used in their record-keeping. To some readers, this realism felt out of place in mythology. If the gods behaved like people, maybe they had once been people. By the mid-20th century, that thought had evolved into a question. What if the Sumerians were recording something real, encounters, not allegories? Archaeology had already shown that their cities were not mythic but tangible. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur and Ur had been buried, not imagined. The flood had left physical traces. If the places and events were real, could the beings described have been real as well? Most historians dismissed the idea immediately, but a few voices refused to let it go. In the 1970s, a writer named Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet, a book that would ignite one of the most enduring alternative interpretations of ancient Mesopotamian mythology. Sitchin wasn't an academic, but he was a passionate reader of Sumerian texts, and his theory was bold. He proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods in the spiritual sense, but visitors, beings from another world who came to Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago. According to his reading, they came from a distant planet he called Nibiru, whose elongated orbit brought it close to Earth every 3,600 years, a period corresponding, interestingly, to the Sumerian unit of time called the Sar. Sitchin claimed that these visitors had genetically engineered early humans, combining their own DNA with that of hominids to create a labour force capable of mining resources, particularly gold. In his interpretation, the long reigns of the pre-flood kings weren't symbolic but literal, a record of the immense lifespans of these beings. The flood in turn was not a divine punishment, but a planetary catastrophe that forced the Anunnaki to intervene once again. It was a narrative that blended archaeology, myth, and science fiction into something new, a cosmic history hiding in plain sight. Mainstream scholars rejected Sitchin's theory almost immediately, pointing out numerous translation errors and misunderstandings of Sumerian grammar. But his work struck a chord with readers. For people living in a century defined by space travel and nuclear discovery, the idea that the gods were astronauts felt strangely logical. Humanity had begun to reach beyond Earth. Perhaps others had done the same long ago. The Sumerian King List, with its precise numbers and divine reigns, suddenly looked like a document of contact, a record not of theology, but of technology. It's easy to see why the theory spread. The Sumerians had described their gods as descending from the sky in brilliant vessels, accompanied by fire and noise. They had built temples designed as landing platforms, with stairways connecting heaven and earth. They had detailed the teaching of agriculture, mathematics, and metallurgy, all delivered by the gods. To the ancient mind, those gifts were divine. To the modern imagination, they looked like technology. But whether or not one accepts Sitchin's interpretation, his impact is undeniable. He reignited global fascination with Sumerian mythology. People who had never heard of Eridu or Enki or the King List began to explore them. The Anunnaki became cultural icons, appearing in documentaries, novels, and endless online debates. What Sitchin had tapped into wasn't simply curiosity about ancient aliens. It was something deeper, the longing for connection between our technological present and our mythic past. If you strip away the speculation, that longing makes sense. The The Sumerians were, after all, the first known scientists. They measured the skies, charted planetary movements, calculated time, built irrigation systems, and invented writing. To modern observers, their sudden leap into complexity seems almost unexplainable. How did a single region, 5,000 years ago, develop nearly every foundational aspect of civilization in such a short span? The Anunnaki theory offered an answer that, while unorthodox, satisfied a modern appetite for grand explanation. Perhaps humanity had help. It's worth remembering, though, that the Sumerians themselves never described their gods as foreign invaders. They didn't see the Anunnaki as external to the world, but as part of its structure. Their word for heaven, An, wasn't outer space. It was the visible sky, the divine realm intertwined with earth. When they said kingship descended from heaven, they weren't imagining beings arriving in ships. They were describing legitimacy flowing from the cosmic order. To them, the Anunnaki weren't strangers. They were the logic of the universe personified. Yet, the persistence of modern Anunnaki theories says something profound about how we read ancient texts. We project our own paradigms onto them. For the Victorians, the Sumerians were the ancestors of civilization. For the mid-20th century, they were ancient engineers. For today's researchers, they're the first systems thinkers. Each generation sees its own reflection in those clay tablets. The Anunnaki become whatever our era needs them to be. Gods, aliens, archetypes, metaphors. That adaptability is part of their power. They refuse to stay in one category. There's also something poetic, in a literal sense, about how Sitchin and others reimagined them. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki as beings of wisdom and measurement, who shaped humanity not by magic but by instruction. Even if one removes the extraterrestrial angle, the core idea remains that civilization itself was a kind of inheritance, passed down by those who came before and understood more than we did. Whether those teachers were gods, mythic ancestors, or simply earlier cultures, the myth captures a truth. Knowledge feels like a gift from somewhere beyond. The debate over the Anunnaki reflects the broader tension between skepticism and wonder. Scholars demand evidence, believers demand meaning. Between them lies the same space the Sumerians once occupied, the space between gods and history. The difference is that we've replaced their clay with data, their rituals with research papers, their temples with observatories. But we're still asking the same questions. Who taught us what we know? Why did civilization begin where it did? What does it mean that we can measure the heavens but not fully explain ourselves? When you look at the archaeological record, it's clear that Sumer didn't emerge in isolation. Its roots reach back to older cultures like Ubaid and Samara, societies that already had organised agriculture and proto-writing. The transition wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. But in the King List, that slow evolution is compressed into a single narrative, the descent of kingship, the transfer of divine order. It's not that the Sumerians thought civilization appeared overnight, it's that they understood progress as inheritance. Someone, divine or otherwise, always passes the torch. That perspective makes the Anunnaki theories less strange. Whether one interprets them as gods, extraterrestrials, or metaphors for lost knowledge, they all express the same intuition, that humanity didn't build civilization alone. There's humility in that idea, and also longing. It's the same feeling that drives people to search for intelligent life in the universe, not fear, but kinship. To imagine the Anunnaki as visitors is in a way to hope that intelligence is universal, that consciousness seeks company. Still, if we return to the Sumerians themselves, what they described is more profound than alien contact. The Anunnaki weren't a race of beings, they were a structure of meaning. They represented the invisible forces that sustain order, time, fertility, justice, wisdom. By personifying them, the Sumerians gave shape to abstraction. They didn't need spaceships to explain their gods because their gods already existed in everything measurable. When Enki organized the world by decree, when Inanna ruled over love and conflict, when Enlil controlled the winds, those weren't myths about visitors. They were systems of explanation. The Sumerians were building a mental universe where every phenomenon had agency. That mental universe is easy to underestimate. The Anunnaki weren't primitive idols. They were early scientific principles wrapped in narrative. The concept that creation operates through order, that power can be divided into domains, that cause and effect follow cosmic law. Those are scientific intuitions. The difference is that we write them in equations. They wrote them in myths. The Anunnaki were their formulas, expressed in human form. Yet, we keep returning to the literal. The temptation to treat the myths as historical records is understandable. We crave certainty, and myth is flexible enough to accommodate it. It can be metaphor when we need poetry and evidence when we want history. That's why the Anunnaki theories survive, not because they're provable, but because they feel complete. They merge mystery with coherence. They say, here's why we began, here's who guided us, here's what we lost. It's a story that gives cosmic scale to human purpose. But perhaps the deeper truth lies in the middle ground, that the Sumerians weren't describing external beings but internal archetypes. The Anunnaki might represent facets of the human mind awakening to its own potential: creativity, organization, curiosity, rebellion. Their descent from heaven might symbolize consciousness, emerging from instinct, intellect, rising from chaos. The King List could be the record not of alien kings, but of humanity's growing control over time itself. That interpretation doesn't diminish the myth, it fulfills it. It says the gods didn't create us, they became us. In the end, whether one sees the Anunnaki as divine, extraterrestrial, or symbolic, they occupy the same space in the human story. They are the bridge between the unknown and the known. They remind us that every explanation, however rational, begins as a myth. The first scientist was also the first priest, staring at the same stars and wondering who else might be watching. The Sumerians gave that wonder a name, Anunnaki, and we've been trying to translate it ever since. The real legacy of the Anunnaki theories may not be in the details, but in the dialogue they provoke. They force us to confront how little we truly understand about our origins, how much of our knowledge rests on fragments of clay and interpretation. They make us question what we consider impossible, and they remind us that disbelief can sometimes be as limiting as faith. The Sumerians left us a message written in numbers, names, and cycles, and it's only natural that we keep trying to decode it. Each age in its own language, and maybe that's the point. The Anunnaki don't need to be literal to be real. They exist in the same way gravity or time exists, as frameworks we use to understand the world. Whether they came from the stars or from the imagination of the first astronomers doesn't change their role. They are the first articulation of the idea that intelligence governs the universe, that order has a source. The Sumerians called that intelligence divine. We call it physics. The vocabulary changes, but the impulse is the same. So when modern readers see in the Anunnaki the traces of forgotten science, they're not wrong in spirit. They're responding to the same awe the Sumerians felt, the sense that knowledge must come from somewhere beyond reach. The difference is only in perspective. The Sumerians looked upward and saw gods. We look upward and see galaxies. Both views come from the same instinct. To map the unknown, to find ourselves reflected in the vastness. That's why the story of the Anunnaki endures. It's not a closed question, but a mirror for our own curiosity. The tablets may be old, the symbols ancient, but the questions they raise are still alive. Who are we? Where did we come from? Are we alone? The Sumerians answered with myth. We answer with science. And somewhere between the two, between gods and galaxies, the Anunnaki remain, silent, ancient, waiting for each generation to rediscover them in its own way. And as the King List continues beyond their names, as the divine fades fully into the mortal, humanity begins to realize that the task of maintaining order no longer belongs to heaven, it belongs to us. The next part of the story is no longer about God shaping men, but men shaping the world, carrying the logic of the divine forward, writing new lines into the endless clay of time. Every civilization leaves two kinds of ruins, the ones we can see and the ones we can't. The first are easy to recognize: broken walls, temples reclaimed by dust, fragments of pottery scattered across the sand. The second kind lives in silence: ideas, symbols, and memories that move invisibly through time. The Sumerian King List belongs to both worlds. It's a physical artifact, a piece of clay marked with a stylus 5,000 years ago, but it's also a resonance, an echo that shaped how every later civilization thought about order, legitimacy, and time. Even when its language was forgotten, its rhythm survived. When scholars first pieced together the King List, they didn't just uncover an ancient document, they discovered a pattern. The idea that history follows a sequence, that kingdoms rise, fall, and pass their power to others, didn't end with Sumer. It became the mental architecture of all civilizations that followed. You can trace its echo in Egypt's dynasties, in China's mandate of heaven, in Rome's succession of emperors. Every culture after Sumer, whether it knew it or not, lived inside the framework the Sumerians invented. The belief that history has structure. That structure is more than a chronology, it's a world view. The Sumerians didn't see the past as a list of disconnected events. They saw it as a flowing current, one that carried divine purpose through time. Kingship wasn't just political authority. It was the vessel that contained the world's equilibrium. When a dynasty failed, it wasn't only a crisis of power, but a disturbance in cosmic balance. The same logic later appeared everywhere, in the pharaoh's role as guarantor of Ma'at, in the Chinese emperor's duty to maintain harmony between heaven and earth, in medieval Europe's notion of the divine right of kings. The Sumerians had created the template, and the echo of it still hums in the way we think about legitimacy today. But beyond their political legacy, there's another echo, quieter, stranger, harder to define. It's the one that surfaces every time humanity encounters the mystery of sudden beginnings. Whenever we find traces of a culture that seems too advanced for its time, we hear the same question: who taught them? The Sumerians didn't just build the first cities, they invented writing, law, mathematics, astronomy, and government almost at once. The abruptness of that leap still unsettles historians. There were older human societies, but none had compressed so much complexity into so little time. The King List, with its mention of divine descent, almost feels like an attempt to explain that miracle, a mythic answer to a historical question. Civilization appeared because the gods gave it to us. The question hasn't gone away. Every generation rediscovers it in a new form. We find megaliths older than known empires, lost cities under the sea, alignments of stone that match the stars. We find technological precision in artifacts that seem too early for it. And each time the old pattern stirs, the suspicion that somewhere in the past knowledge appeared that shouldn't have. The Sumerians are often the starting point for those mysteries because their record is the oldest coherent one we have. The King List is not just their story. It's the moment human history begins to remember itself. Before it, time was myth. After it, time became measurable. That threshold still defines how we separate the known from the forgotten. It's not that there were no civilizations before Sumer. There were. The Ubaid culture, which preceded it, built settlements, practiced agriculture, and shaped the foundation Sumer would build upon. Before Ubaid came the Halaf and Samara cultures, each contributing to the gradual evolution of human society. But when Sumer appears, something changes in kind, not just degree. The scale of organization, the speed of innovation, the integration of religion and administration all seem to arrive at once, as if the fragments of earlier cultures suddenly fused into coherence. That transformation is the true mystery, and it's one that no theory, divine or material, fully resolves. Some see in it the inevitable result of cumulative progress. Human populations were growing, resources increasing, trade expanding, knowledge accumulated, and eventually a threshold was crossed. But others see it differently. They point to the precision of early Sumerian astronomy, the complexity of their myths, the mathematical sophistication embedded in their religious systems. They ask how a civilization could begin at such a height, with no visible staircase leading up to it. It's as if we walked into a room and found a clock already ticking, its maker gone. The King List, with its record of rulers who reigned before the flood, feels like a memory of that missing prelude, a whisper of worlds older than we can prove. That whisper has inspired countless theories. Some connect it to the lost continent of Atlantis, others to the ruins beneath Lake Titicaca, or to the Indus Valley, or to pre-dynastic Egypt. Each theory, no matter how speculative, reflects the same human instinct: to imagine continuity where evidence breaks. The echo of lost civilizations isn't just about archaeology, it's about psychology. We can't accept that knowledge might appear, vanish, and leave no trace. We need inheritance. We need a chain. The Sumerians understood that instinct better than anyone. That's why their king list begins with the descent of kingship from heaven. It's a symbolic lineage, not just divine, but intellectual. Knowledge must have a source, and for them, that source was the divine. For us, it's the unknown. The words have changed, the desire hasn't. Archaeologists often find themselves standing between skepticism and wonder. They dig through layers of soil, measure the carbon, analyse the pottery, and still feel something they can't quantify: the weight of continuity. Beneath every ruin lies another, and beneath that, another still. Civilizations rise, fall, and leave echoes in the ones that follow. Sometimes the echoes are clear: a borrowed god, a shared measurement system, a myth retold in a new tongue. Sometimes they're faint, embedded in geometry or proportion or astronomical alignment. The Sumerians aligned their temples with the stars, as did the Egyptians and the Maya. Separated by oceans and millennia, they still seem to follow the same celestial logic. Whether that's coincidence, convergence, or inheritance, it feels like a shared memory, a resonance of order carried forward from a deeper past. There's an irony in how these echoes survive. Stone crumbles, but pattern endures. A temple can collapse, but its alignment with the solstice can be rediscovered. A language can die, but its structure can survive in the grammar of its descendants. The Sumerian word for Lord, En, became Elu in Akkadian, El in Hebrew, Allah in Arabic. Words travel like fossils through time, carrying traces of vanished worlds. The same is true for myths. The flood story appears in Sumer, then Babylon, then the Bible, then countless other cultures. It's as if the trauma of one civilization became the memory of all. Even when history loses its records, the rhythm of civilization repeats. A culture rises, invents order, reaches stability, then declines. Another takes its place, adopting fragments of the old. The King List records that process as divine descent, but we can also read it as an early model of historical pattern recognition. The Sumerians didn't invent rise and fall, they noticed it. They lived long enough, and carefully enough, to see history's shape. Every later civilization that thought itself eternal was in some sense ignoring that lesson. The Echo of Sumer warns that time has no favourites. Every city, no matter how glorious, eventually becomes a mound in the sand. And yet, the echo isn't tragic, it's persistent. The Sumerians believed in renewal. When kingship moved from one city to another, it wasn't the end but the continuation of the divine plan. The same applies to civilizations. The collapse of one becomes the foundation of the next. Ur falls, Babylon rises, Babylon fades, Persia ascends. Each carries the memory of the last, transformed but recognizable. In that way, the King List was prophetic. It didn't just record the past, it predicted the cycle. Even today, traces of Sumer linger in our world in ways we rarely notice. The way we divide time, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, comes from their base 60 mathematics. Our 12-month calendar echoes their lunar divisions. Our writing, law, and bureaucracy all descend, in structure if not in form, from theirs. The echo isn't metaphorical, it's embedded in our daily routines. When we measure, calculate, record, we're continuing their legacy. The Sumerians didn't vanish, they diffused. They became the background of civilization itself. But the other kind of echo, the one that haunts speculation, still endures. It asks whether even the Sumerians were inheritors, not originators. Whether the divine descent they described was a memory of something older, now lost. In that sense, the King List isn't just the first history, it's also the first archaeology. It hints at layers below its own foundation. The flood in this reading isn't just a catastrophe, it's a metaphor for cultural amnesia, a break between ages of knowledge. The pre-flood kings become symbols of what was forgotten, the post-flood rulers of what survived. We can't prove or disprove those lost worlds, but the persistence of their possibility tells us something about ourselves. Civilization, like memory, is never complete. We reconstruct it from fragments, fill the gaps with inference and call it history. The King List is honest about that process. It admits the flood, admits the gaps, and then begins again. It's not a perfect record, it's a recovery. Every line begins where certainty ends. Perhaps that's why the idea of lost civilizations continues to fascinate us. It gives hope that knowledge isn't linear, that progress can be regained even after collapse. The Sumerians understood that rhythm intuitively. They saw destruction not as an end, but as a necessary phase in the cycle of renewal. Their myths of death and rebirth, of Inanna's descent into the underworld and return, of Dumuzi's seasonal resurrection, echo the same logic. The world must break to begin again. Civilizations too follow that pattern. What makes the Sumerian version remarkable is that they wrote it down. They didn't just live through cycles, they documented them. That act of writing made the echo permanent. Even when the cities fell, the tablets survived, carrying the pattern forward. The King List is both record and instruction. It tells future generations that loss is not failure, that the flood is not erasure, that kingship, and by extension civilization, will always descend again. It's the oldest reassurance humanity ever wrote, and maybe that's why its resonance is still so strong. We live in an age that fears collapse, environmental, political, technological. We look back at Sumer and see a mirror. Their floods are our crises. Their kings are our leaders. Their longing for continuity is ours. When we study their ruins, we're not just learning about them, we're listening for our own future. The echo of lost civilizations isn't only a sound from the past, it's a forecast. It reminds us that we are part of the same cycle, the same experiment of order rising from chaos. The Sumerians may have been the first to write history, but they weren't the last to lose it. Every culture believes its knowledge will endure, few do. What survives is what can be remembered, or what can be rediscovered. The King List is proof that memory can survive even when context doesn't. Its survival through millennia, across languages and empires, suggests that meaning itself has momentum. Once something is recorded, it never fully disappears, it waits. So when we speak of lost civilizations, of Atlantis, of Lemuria, of vanished empires, we're really speaking of that waiting. We're acknowledging the possibility that the past still holds more than we know. The Sumerians felt the same. Their flood was both an ending and a veil. Beyond it lay a world erased but not forgotten, a time of gods and kings whose memory lingered in names and numbers. The King List doesn't claim to understand that world. It simply preserves its outline, and maybe that's all history can ever do. Keep the echo alive until we learn to hear it again. The clay that carried their stories was made from the same ground that once buried them. In every sense, the Sumerians wrote their memory into the earth. That's why, when archaeologists unearthed those tablets, it felt less like discovery and more like conversation resumed. The voices that spoke of lost cities, divine kings and floods were speaking to us across time, reminding us that what is buried is never gone. It's only waiting for someone to listen. And as we listen, the pattern continues. The Sumerians became the Babylonians. The Babylonians became the Persians. Each carried the same logic of descent, the same faith in order. The echo grew softer but never vanished. Even now, in our modern age of satellites and data, the structure they invented still governs us. We still measure time by their numbers. We still build stories around their rhythm of fall and renewal. We still search for what they called divine, not in temples now, but in knowledge itself. The echo of lost civilizations has become the hum of continuity, and in that hum lies the unbroken thread of human persistence, the belief that no matter how deep the flood, something survives, something remembers, something waits to be found. The Sumerians wrote that faith into clay, and it has never stopped speaking. If you visit the British Museum and stand before the cuneiform tablets that make up the Sumerian King List, you may notice how ordinary they look. Small slabs of clay, faded brown, their surfaces covered in tiny wedge marks that mean nothing to the untrained eye. They don't shine like gold or tower like statues. They don't proclaim power through size or splendour. Yet those marks contain more authority than any crown ever worn, because inside them kings still reign, not in palaces or tombs, but in memory. Their cities have fallen, their languages are gone, but their names continue to shape the way we understand rule, legacy, and time. The King List ends long before the age of empires we remember best. It closes in a world of mud brick walls, canals, and barley fields, centuries before Hammurabi carved his laws, before Nebuchadnezzar built his gardens, before Alexander crossed the Tigris. But its influence stretches through them all. The kings of Sumer, whose reigns were once counted in thousands of years, became the prototypes of every ruler who came after. To be king was to stand within that lineage, whether one believed in the Anunnaki or not. Even after the gods withdrew, the pattern of kingship remained. Sacred descent, cosmic duty, succession through order. Those who ruled after Sumer were, in a sense, still ruling within its memory. Names like Alulim, Alalgar, Enmenluana. They sound distant now, more like incantations than names. But to the Sumerians, these were not imaginary figures. They were the foundations of the world's structure. To list them was to preserve the architecture of legitimacy. Each ruler, divine or human, was part of a sequence that connected heaven and earth. The King List wasn't a record of individuals, it was a map of continuity. When later civilizations adopted the idea of divine kingship, they were echoing that same map, even if they no longer remembered where it came from. Take Egypt, for example. The pharaoh's rule was justified through Ma'at, the principle of universal order. The king was not just a man, but the embodiment of cosmic balance. His duty was to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and the underworld. That concept mirrors the Sumerian belief that kingship was a reflection of divine architecture. Both civilizations imagined authority not as conquest, but as alignment. The ruler didn't own the world, he stabilized it. The King List expresses that perfectly. Each line is a rebalancing, a passing of the axis from one city to another, ensuring the world stays in rhythm. You can see the same echo in later ideas of rulership. The Chinese spoke of the mandate of heaven, the belief that a ruler governed with divine approval as long as he maintained virtue and harmony. When he failed, heaven withdrew its mandate and rebellion became legitimate. That's not so different from the logic of the King List. When a Sumerian city lost kingship, it wasn't a sign of collapse. It was evidence that divine favour had moved elsewhere. Legitimacy was transferable, not permanent. The king's task was not to seize heaven's favour, but to keep it as long as he could. Even in modern politics, stripped of theology, the idea survives. Leaders still inherit legitimacy through continuity. Dynasties, constitutions, institutions all exist to maintain unbroken sequence. We may no longer call it kingship descending from heaven, but we still treat legitimacy as something passed down, something that must be received, not self-created. The Sumerian logic remains buried beneath secular language. When governments justify authority through law, when societies revere tradition, when nations celebrate founders as semi-sacred figures, they are reenacting the same ritual that began in the cities of Sumer. The kings themselves, those early names carved into clay, occupy a peculiar space between history and myth. Archaeologists can confirm only a few of them. Enma-Baragesi of Kish, mentioned in inscriptions discovered at modern Tel Haimir, was a real person who lived around 2600 BCE. His son, Aga of Kish, appears in Sumerian epics as a rival of Gilgamesh. These overlaps between text and archaeology make the King List both mysterious and credible. It mixes verified rulers with those who belong entirely to the realm of legend, but that blend is what gives it power. To the Sumerians, the difference didn't matter. What mattered was that every ruler was part of the same continuum. The divine didn't end where the human began. They were two ends of one thread. Gilgamesh himself, half myth, half man, is the perfect symbol of that continuity. The King List names him as a ruler of Uruk, but his story, preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, transcends history. He searches for immortality, defies gods, faces the inevitability of death, and returns home wiser, but unchanged by fate. His journey mirrors the fate of all civilizations, the quest for permanence in a world that erases everything. Through him, kingship becomes philosophy. The king is not immortal in body, but in remembrance. The Sumerians didn't know his story would survive millennia, yet they built their entire system around that same idea. Memory as the true seat of power. That idea is visible everywhere in their world. The ziggurats they built weren't just temples, they were monuments to continuity. Each level represented a layer of heaven, and the stairways connecting them symbolized the link between mortal and divine. But they were also statements of endurance. To build in brick, to inscribe in clay, to measure in numbers. These were acts of defiance against decay. The kings commissioned temples not only to honour gods, but to secure their own memory. The King List is the same impulse made permanent in text. It's the ziggurat of writing built to bridge heaven and history. Over time, as Sumer faded and its cities were absorbed into empires, its kings disappeared from memory. Yet their system of thought persisted. The Babylonians adopted it, writing their own chronicles of reigns and successions. The Assyrians followed, turning kingship into empire, embedding divine legitimacy in conquest. The Persians expanded it further, ruling through law and divine order. By the time Alexander reached Mesopotamia, the region had seen thousands of years of rulers all following a script written in clay. The names changed, the structure didn't. The Sumerian kings were gone, but they still ruled through the systems they had invented. Even the later religions that replaced polytheism inherited Sumerian logic. The Abrahamic God, though singular, still delegates authority through chosen figures, prophets, kings, judges. The notion that divine order requires human custodians remains. In Christianity, kings claim to rule by God's will. In Islam, caliphs governed as stewards of divine law. In Judaism, kings were anointed through covenant. All of these echo the same original pattern, divine authority expressed through human succession. The Sumerians wouldn't have recognized the details, but they would have understood the principle completely. There's something almost eerie in how those ancient kings persist, not as individuals, but as archetypes. The ruler who mediates between heaven and earth, the one who maintains order, faces rebellion, and seeks legacy. That story never ends. It simply changes costume. In literature, in politics, in myth, the figure returns endlessly. Every empire builds its version of Gilgamesh, its model of the king who carries divine or ideological burden. The Sumerian kings still rule in the way archetypes rule, invisibly but absolutely. And yet their real victory lies not in empire or architecture, but in endurance through memory. No army could protect their cities from erosion, but their words outlasted everything. The invention of writing transformed power into permanence. Once authority could be inscribed, it no longer depended on presence. A dead king could still command through a decree etched in clay. A forgotten dynasty could still live in lists copied by later scribes. The King List embodies that shift from physical to symbolic rule. It turns kingship into information, and information, as we've learned, never dies. It only changes form. You can see the same logic in our own time. We don't think of presidents or prime ministers as divine, but we still preserve their names in records, carve their faces into stone, archive their words. We still measure legitimacy through documentation. Our memory systems, books, archives, data, are the modern equivalent of clay tablets. The same instinct drives them, to make time obey by writing it down. The Sumerians began that practice and we've never stopped. But there's another layer to their endurance, one that's harder to measure. The Sumerians didn't just invent record keeping, they invented the consciousness that accompanies it. To record is to reflect, to see oneself as part of history rather than a victim of it. Their kings weren't just rulers, they were participants in a cosmic timeline. They knew their names would be read aloud, that each reign would be counted. That awareness changed the nature of leadership. A king who rules under the gaze of eternity governs differently from one who expects to be forgotten. In that sense, the King List didn't just preserve history, it shaped behaviour. It made kings aware that they were temporary actors in a permanent story. And that awareness survives too. Modern leaders, artists, thinkers, all act under the weight of legacy. The desire to be remembered is a direct inheritance from those early rulers. The difference is only in scale. We no longer build ziggurats, we build institutions, monuments and digital archives. But the motivation is identical, to resist erasure, to remain part of the story. The Sumerian kings began that race against forgetting, and every generation since has continued it. Sometimes, when we read the King List today, it feels almost mathematical in its detachment. Name, city, years, succession. Yet behind that simplicity lies profound emotion. Each entry is a heartbeat of a civilization trying to stay alive in memory. The rhythm of then kingship was taken to isn't just narrative, it's ritual breathing. It's civilization inhaling and exhaling across time. The kings themselves may be dust, but their memory still circulates through us, through our systems, our traditions, our ideas about order. In that way, they achieved what Gilgamesh could not. They found a form of immortality that didn't depend on the body or even on belief, only on the durability of record. The King List became their afterlife, the text through which they continued to exist. Each time someone reads their names, the old cities rise again for a moment. The flood recedes, the temples stand, and kingship descends once more. The clay remembers what the world forgets, and perhaps that's the real lesson those kings left behind. That memory itself is the truest form of rule. Empires crumble, monuments fade, but what is remembered continues to govern thought, behaviour, and imagination. The Sumerians built their system on that principle. They trusted clay more than stone, because clay could be rewritten, recopied, reinterpreted. Their kings understood that survival didn't mean eternity, it meant continuity. To rule forever was impossible. To be remembered forever was enough. That's why their story still feels relevant. The world changes, technologies shift, languages evolve, but the logic of legacy remains. The kings of Sumer still rule every time we trace a line of history, every time we date an event, every time we measure legitimacy by descent or sequence. They govern not through armies or decrees, but through structure, the unseen framework that organises our understanding of time. They are the kings who still rule in memory, their reigns measured not in years but in relevance. Their authority is quiet but pervasive, woven into every system of continuity humanity has ever built. When we remember them, we're not reviving myth, we're acknowledging inheritance. The tablets that bear their names are not relics. They are mirrors, reflections of our own need to be remembered, our own desire to give meaning to the passage of time. And as the story of kingship descends through the ages, reshaped by each civilization that inherits it, it continues to do what it was always meant to do. Preserve the sense that the world has order, that the past is never lost, and that power in its purest form belongs to those who understand that memory outlasts all crowns. Because somewhere, deep in the silence of the museums and the buried ruins, those first kings still reign, not as rulers of men, but as rulers of the idea that to write is to endure, to be remembered is to exist, and to be listed is to live again.